Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to Let's Start Story on What If Naruto Was Son of Divine Moon and Naruto X Hinata So Do 4 Blue Hearts comment, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video and please share with your friends and watch till end. Also check out Patreon for I have upload Naruto X Rias and Akino uncensored spicy version, link in description. Live every day as if it were your last. The words were simple and clear. That day they were spoken by a friendly sensei, they had resonated deep into Hinata's mind. To live each day as if it were your last. As a shinobi, no other phrase could mean more in one's personal agendas. Today could easily be your last tomorrow, you had to make it count for something. But oftentimes, Hinata didn't act on the thoughts that raced around her like shuriken, beating, striking, and slicing at her until she broke down in a messy conglomeration of ninja and hopeless little lost girl. At months away from 17. This really hadn't changed much, this theory still stood steadfast, detectable by the current state of affairs that had ensued in only moments. The mission had been easy enough so far. Take the scroll, carry the scroll, and deliver the scroll. The two bands of rogues only hours apart had not been part of the plan, no step had ever included their appearance. But then again, that was surprise. Hinata was not doing so well. No, actually, she was doing horrible. Curse Byakugan and its uncanny abilities to drain one of chakra in what seemed like only a few minutes, time weighed like hours in the fight going on. She blocked the mental fatigue of being worried and focused on her enemy, racking up numbers. 4, 8, 32. They continued till the fall, his heavy body disintegrating onto the turf of the roadside. She was only vaguely aware of his presence beside her, slash, kick, and tumble, up again. It was all limbs and blood and swears. She danced in and out of her opponent's grasp, eyelashes fluttering. Clothes flags in the wind, ethereal, beautiful, and silent. She had no time for words, they distracted, they were a burden. Naruto was already occupied, she LD go without her typical sounds of concentration, the ringing of numbers off of trees. He passed the peripheral of her vision before leaping away, unseen. She had only hesitated a moment to watch his fleeting form, aware he was not abandoning her, and leapt forward again, hands distended. They were heavily outnumbered. 10-2 was not a walk in the park, even for someone as seasoned as them, especially when only 6 were dead. Her eyes wavered and she stumbled on her footing, a low pant echoing off of her lips. No time. Keep moving, moving. Seeing, lurch, strike, see. She pressed forward on her toes. Balls of her feet springing up and landing the palm of her hand deep in his chest. Blood littered his lips and she relaxed, like an exhale of air. The sword drove through her arm without even warning. How could she have been so stupid? Hadn't she seen him coming behind her? Sweat mixed with blood on her brow and she gasped, Byakugan wavering, holding, flickers of white-hot pain across the spectrum of violet. Blurring everything out. 3 days of non-stop travel and Naruto as a partner. Chakra deprivation and too many to keep up with. A knife in her arm, cutting and tearing and the mistake was a natural response, though she should have been better disciplined to have let it come to this. She should never, ever have let it get in the way. Hinata stumbled, and she screamed. After that, Hinata was vaguely aware of the tearing of the underbrush as he rocketed out. Blood ran between her fingers as she touched her arm. It was cut deep to the bone, maybe even past. Her head bobbed forward and she opened her mouth in an attempt to find reason, but everything was going too fast. Flicker. Byakugan, chakra, holding on. She would not let her knees hit the ground, but they did anyway. She raised her head, eyes still fighting to focus, the kunai still clutched in her palm. When had that gotten there? Reflex. Yellow streaked in and out of the frame, her mind not having enough time to catch up. She was still panting, there was blood all over her sleeve, all over her hand, her chest, the grass. She watched in stupor as the two danced, rough, vicious, feral. Nothing at all like the refined softness of her heritage, yet so beautiful she was enthralled. Even when the katana plunged through his chest, still wet with her own life, she was mystified by the carnal grace. Her head shocked with pain. Byakugan kicking in again, tearing through everything. It all threaded together instantly. 360 degrees of 2 seconds ago. Then it burnt out and everything was blurs again. Hinata realized that Naruto was no longer up, the shinobi clinging to a tree, hanging on by a thread of will, hand clutching his stomach. Entrails spilled out, slashed raggedly. Hinata's brain buzzed and hummed as she stood shakily, fighting her way across the clearing, watching the shinobi die out of the corner of her eye. Her mind was in too much chaos to form coherent words. All that came out were strangled questions. En Naruto. En Naru. Her knee gave out again and she yelped, grasping her arm before the boy. She reached out her hand to touch his chest, searching. Where was his heart? She couldn't find it. No thrum, no steady pulse she'd heard a million times this mission, no flutter when he got excited, no drum when he was still. Red seeped out of his wounds, congealing around the handle of the sword, burning. His skin was pale, but his body felt like fire. Where was his heart? Naruto. Her shout was choked as she threw her hands on him, still searching. The red burnt her hands. What? Questions burned her mind, searing. She should never have screamed, never. Then, maybe he wouldn't be. Tears clouded everything and dripped onto his lifeless body, those blue eyes frozen open and skyward. No, 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 no. She stared at him and her heart thrummed, blood rushing from her arm. She didn't know what to do, so she did the only thing she could. Byakugan. Piercing, blinding pain. Her head screamed, or maybe it was her mouth. She couldn't tell. All she knew was that the pain had been instant, her eyes no longer seeing the moment they had engaged. I didn't have the strength to ask why as she collapsed forward over him, the red still spilling from him like blood. Her eyes fluttered, numb, and then, Hinata fell, his name still tickling her lips. She didn't know how long she floated. Lights popping like camera flashes past her. She was in deep water, but she wasn't wet, surrounded by bubbles that floated from her nose and throat, thick and rippling like honey. She watched them with shaded eyes, her mind still as death. Death, was she dead? Another bubble and she turned her head lazily to the side. She was tired, but she was still alive. A lock of indigo hair swayed on the waves. Light penetrating her world from the surface. Her hand was ghostly pale as she reached out to touch the sphere, it dancing precariously close to her outstretched fingers. Light danced in her eyes. Still flashing and flickering like static, reflected off of the incandescent surface of her former breath. She watched, mesmerized, clothes still flowing with invisible currents. Held up and suspended within nothing. She watched, and then suddenly, the bubble popped and with its dissipation went the light. And with the darkness came the thrust. She was still, and then rocketed upwards. Spinning and whirling in unidentifiable hues and great glowing swirls of something. Violet, blue, red, and lavender chased each other through the fray as her eyes widened, still trying to take in the sights of her inner conscious, or at least what she thought was her inner conscious. The black around her began to melt away, creating a million pinpoints eaten up by the colors that were invading. Still thrusting her forward into what she didn't know. And as soon as it had begun, it stopped her, and she was once again floating. Suddenly, water filled her lungs and she coughed and sputtered and gasped. Choking and treading in the water she'd landed in, kicking to the surface. She fought for the air she could see, the sunlight creeping through the depths. Her hand reached up, and her head followed. Breaking the surface of her dreams. Hinata catapulted her head up, her chest heaving, eyes wide and lips dry. She blinked her eyes and trembled, unable to feel the dampness of her skin, only dry. Her eyes squeezed shut and then opened again as she stared at her perfectly normal hand from its position among the tangle of what appeared to be bed sheets. She lifted it, still in awe that it was intact and not covered in blood from her arm. She immediately looked to the injury, but found nothing but the charcoal gray sleeve of a cotton shirt, and when she pushed it back there was nothing there. Not even a scar. Her mind fought against the confusion. What? Her words were mumbled in disbelief as she looked at the bed below her. Bed. When had she? She took up a bit of the sheet. Rubbing it through her fingers before lifting her head to stare at the room she was in. White walls and soft tan woods accented little pops of color here and there, a door. Way to the right of the bed led to what appeared to be a tiled bathroom, simple and clean. It was a beautiful room, but unfamiliar. It was too simple to be her room at home, or any of the traditional homes she'd ever been in Konoha. It was too big to be Shino's or Kiba's houses either, too big and too clean. She whipped her head to the other side, seeing the broad window with fluttering curtains. Cracked in the early dusk of the morning, letting in the smell of grass and wet earth. What? she exclaimed this time, entangling herself from the covers, only to get more entwined. She thrashed in some kind of mad hysteria and confusion and suddenly, found herself on the floor, knocking her head painfully on what appeared to be a bedside table. Something fell off with the force of the impact, rashing towards the floor, and she heard the sound of shattering glass above her mad attempts to get the sheet off of her legs. She panted, her face flushed, and finally kicked free, knocking back into the table as she went backwards. It rattling loudly. As she hissed in pain, she rubbed the back of her head and looked at whatever had fallen. A picture frame, face down, glass sticking out from the thin trim of metal surrounding it. She stared at it for a very long time, too afraid to turn it over. Instead, she stared at the foreign wood floor and saw a scratch on her leg from where it had caught the edge of the low bed frame when she'd fallen in desperate means to escape. She'd never ever been in this room before, and it frightened her senseless. All at once, the scene at the clearing came flooding back, and with it miles of confusion. Where was her injury? Where were the trees and twilight and smell of blood and death? Her head pounded sharply and she hissed again, rubbing the growing bump. She flexed her fingers, still consumed by the fact that she was able to move at all, and then focused her attentions on the bed beside her. Wherever she was safe at least, but that still didn't really help her situation. And that meant she needed to get out as soon as possible. Get out, and, all too quickly, the sight of the boy with his eyes glazed and skyward in the dusty evening filled her memories, making her tremble with anxiety. If she was here, where was Naruto? Was he all right? Was he alive? She shook her head and almost instantly tears began lacing her eyes. No, he wouldn't be alive. He'd been stabbed straight through the chest, his heart having stopped long before she reached his body. And it had all been her fault. She sank back against the nightstand, one freezing sorrow and guilt taking over like a blanket of snow. It's all my fault. It's all my fault, she whimpered, quiet sobs escaping her body. She couldn't shake the sight of the dead boy from her heart or her mind. The image plastered to her like wet paper. She took another rattling cry and buried her face in the sheet beside her, inhaling its unfamiliar scent with each gasping breath. Here she was, alone in a place she'd never been, probably far from home or captured, and the one boy she'd ever loved with every molecule of her heart was dead. Because of her, she was so consumed with herself that Hinata didn't hear the low muffled sigh and groan issued from the bed. The bed that still held an occupant. She didn't see the shaggy head raise and blink in the sun before looking over where she had been to find that the sheets were gone, and so was she. The person rubbed their eyes and yawned before sitting up and crawling across the bed, peering over the side in a daze, stifling another great intake of air with a tan hand. Hina, what are you doing on the floor? Hinata cried again, her own sobs drowning out the sound of the deep, rough and tumble voice. The figure's head tilted in confusion, slowly waking up and coming to find the girl in question crying on the floor. With a low moan of the mattress, it lifted itself off of the bed and slid to the floor beside her, still watching in confusion. Hina-chan, what on earth are you going on about? Hinata's cries ceased as soon as the two hands came to either of her shoulders, rubbing gently through the fabric of her shirt, bringing her back to reality. She stared at her legs in silence as the rubbing continued. Was it her, or was the motion almost soothing? Her head jerked up and her hair went flying. Wait, what? She looked to her left shoulder, seeing the heavy lock stick to her cheek and fall down her back. Her hair was long, she said, still looking at the mane that was at least 5 inches long. More than it had been when she'd been fighting in the clearing. Now it was well past her shoulders, collecting in blunt strands by her chest. Long. What do you mean? Her face whipped around again, this time staring in the face the last person in the world she'd ever expected to see. What? He looked at her with confusion, a somewhat unsure grin pulling at his lips. She was speechless. His hair was messily collected on his head. And it too was so much longer than ever, past his ears in golden spikes that made him look like the twin of the fourth. Tan hands were still massaging her shoulder, Huff one of them had come to wipe the stray tears off of her face with a look of unhappiness. He was beautiful. Hina, why were you crying? Are you sad about the picture or something? We can always get a new frame. His blue eyes flicked to the photo before picking it up gently and placing it on the side table, arm stretching, his head coming very close to hers. Hinata went red, and her brain spun out of control. That's the last time we have that much sake before bed, he said, smirking at her and raising his eyebrow. Hinata's mouth opened and closed, gaping like a fish's. How could it be? She stared at him in utter shock. Not only was he alive, but he was. She tried to put her finger on it. He was different somehow. His chest was broader, his face a bit thinner, his body more filled out. Oh my god. It was Naruto. A Naruto who was supposed to be dead. A Naruto who was pretty much kissing her. A Naruto who was at least 3 years older than she was. A Naruto who was going on about sake before bed. Bed. Click, 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 her thoughts popped into place. Holy shit. She'd been in the same bed as Naruto. Somewhere in Hinata's brain a fuse caught flame and burned. And shortly following, several things seemed to explode, everything frying like a malfunctioned circuit. Hinata couldn't help it. She screamed. Naruto could already tell that today was going to be strange. Yep. From this point on things were only going to get weirder, no doubt about that. If the fact that his ankles were being tied to his own bed was any indication, Naruto was pretty sure that Hinata had long since surpassed the average fits woman sometimes through. His bright eyes watched her with depths of confusion as she tightened the uncomfortably complicated knot on his foot, binding him permanently to the bed and thus, helpless under her newly hardened eyes. As she finished the act with finesse she rarely used except when feeling especially empowered, she stepped back and surveyed her work. With eyes blazing a hell's fury and hair as flyaway and crazy as if she'd stepped off the battlefield, Hinata appeared like some kind of relentless Amazon warrior and not the demure beauty she usually was. No, this Hinata was very, very different than usual, and Naruto was slowly drawing the conclusion that something was very off about the situation. Not counting the fact that he was being tied up, but also the events leading up to it. He could admit he wasn't exactly savvy when it came to women, but when it came to Hinata he seemed to know what made her tick, a feat deemed a miracle by many, but still valued highly. He knew things about her that no one else would even dream up. So when he'd seen her crying on the floor in a tangle of sheets he thought it only one of her recurring nightmares come to knocking her literally off the bed. He'd figured comforting her would be smart. Oh, how wrong he was. Turns out instead of melting into him in that feminine way that did his testosterone peak and his male protective switch slam on, she opted for a much different approach. Screaming so loudly it made him tumble backwards, to then cause him to catch foot on discard edge sheets and then catch a swift kick to his gut to be exact. Yeah, way off. Hinata had then leapt from the floor and tackled him, and then somehow he'd ended up here on the bed, with his hands quick why falling asleep behind his back and his circulation being cut off at the ankle. Now Naruto wasn't stupid. He didn't just lie there, no, he protested quite violently, asking multiple times what seemed to be the matter with his Hinata. But all his rapid-fire questions landed on deaf ears. Now, Hinata was just staring at him with a psychotic look in her eyes, and before he could even blink a kunai appeared in her hand as if by magic. Where the hell have you been keeping that? He shouted, craning his neck off the bed. Hinata may have been bordering insanity, but that didn't subtract from the fact that she'd pulled a weapon from a hidden spot on her body, and with nothing but one of his old cotton shirts and those lacy boy shorts she wore for special occasions, it left a lot to the imagination on just where that spot had been. Hinata only hardened her eyes again and stepped aggressively towards her captive, twirling the knife through her fingers in a deceptively calm manner. Who are you? Her voice was calm, quiet. But it held none of the adorable lilt or musical laughter Naruto had long ago fell so soundly for, but instead it took on a cloak of interrogation. Just what on earth was she planning on doing? What was this? An interview with an enemy nin? Hinata, what are you talking about? I'm Naruto, he cried, but it was quickly followed by a sharp scream as she smoothly ripped his shirt into 2 neat sections down his chest. She flipped the knife calmly and Naruto gaped at his destroyed garment. My shirt. Answer truthfully or I'll break the skin next time, she said matter-of-factly. Naruto's face paled and he felt his mouth go dry. Hinata, what's wrong? Are you okay? Answer my question. He winced at her tone, demanding and aggressive, and he could feel the steel on his pulse as she held the knife to his neck. He swallowed thickly. I don't know who told you this was foreplay, but Hinata, you're seriously freaking me out. Hinata pressed the kunai harder, silencing the imposter's babble. She was feeling hopelessly lost, but she couldn't let him see that. She had to get answers before killing him, and that meant pushing aside all the nervousness and konfu Scion and letting the killer shine through. She tried not to make eye contact though, it was tearing her apart to see those blue eyes shining back at her with so much emotion. Whoever this was, they had done a great job at Naruto. But the fact made her angrier than anything else. How dare they mock him in this way? Mock her. He was the only person she'd ever allowed herself to be selfish about, and now he was dead and someone was here pretending to be him. Preying on her like a stupid girl. Hinata knew she was always foolish, and she was always a coward, but she was no idiot. No, never an idiot. So, she ignored his protests and pressed forward, even though her hand was shaking horribly. No, stop, wait, the little girl voice in her head was making her look at him as he continued to mumble explanations. Wait a sec. Hinata. It's me. It's Naruto. If this is about your birthday or something. She paused and drew back, unsure. Birthday, she said softly, eyes probing. Naruto gulped and turned his eyes to the ceiling. Well, you know. I forgot, but Hinata, I've been so busy and, well, not to insult, but 22 isn't exactly the important birthday, or anything. She held her hands out in confusion. Wait, what are you talking about? He looked at her and his eyes were questioning as that deep and bubbly voice surfaced with a tiny amount of relief. For a second she could almost smile at him. The look on his face, the pure hope that maybe he'd get off the hook and she'd forgotten, whatever it was that he was going on about, was so incredibly Naruto that she could almost laugh. The tilt of his mouth, the little gleam of mischief in his eyes, the dandelion crop of hair. Naruto watched in silence as Hinata's expression flickered from angry, to dreamlike in a matter of seconds. A light little blush dusting her cheeks. Finally, something recognizable. He licked his lips and leaned his head off the mattress in hopes that he might awaken still Hinata from her stupor of crazy. Hinata, don't tell me you've forgotten your birthday. You just turned 22 last week. Shino threw you that party, and I forgot to get you something. Hinata didn't hear the last part. She was far too concerned with the second sentence that tumbled from his mouth, hitting her head like a record player needle. You just turned 22 last week. What? No, that's not right. I'm only 17. It was Naruto's turn to be genuinely upset as she cut him off mid-apology with the ridiculous statement. What do you mean you're only 17? She just stared at him. That's it. I'm going crazy. I must be under AG genjutsu or something. She cried, the kunai dropping lifelessly to the floor as she stared at him in disbelief. Naruto just stared back, his eyes wide. Genjutsu. What? No. Hinata, we're at home in the bedroom. What? He shook his head from side to side. I must still be dreaming. We're at home. In the bedroom. She lunged forward towards him. Her hands grasping the fragments of his shirt, fisting in it and pulling him upwards, their noses inches apart. Somewhere, a part of Hinata's heart was pounding out of control. But even that seemed overrode by the mass amounts of crazy that had since taken over. What are you saying? I'm 22. I'm only 17, I passed out last night in a clearing and Naruto was dead. Not alive. But I'm right here. And last night you were here and we went through like 2 bottles of sake. Which I might add is the last time because you've gone absolutely psycho. I'm not even legal. At this exact moment, Hinata went forward just an inch more and in a folly of clumsiness tripped on her own foot, sending her sprawling over Naruto, her knee slamming into a very sensitive part of his anatomy. This caused him to emit a very severe sound and jerk forward, his lips locking very firmly on hers. This made Hinata fist her hands even more into his shirt, ripping it again. Which all occurred at the precise moment a certain Uchiha decided to remind his best friend that just because he was the Hokage did not mean he could sleep in. Sasuke did not like doing favors for people. Uchihas just didn't do it, but when it came to Naruto he always ended up subjecting himself to all sorts of humiliating tasks. But what he was seeing right now, Oidobi. His hand not even having left the doorknob, was by far the most awkward situation he could have ever imagined. It was easy to conclude what was going on, and maybe he should have stopped himself when that shriek emitted from the other side of the door, but no. He was a man with a task, and when it came to tasks and goals he never stopped. No. He was going to wake up that idiot, damn it, and telephone him to haul his hung-over ass to the tower to give him his next assignment and then toss Sakura a quickie before he left. He was a man destined to revive an entire clan, an action that entailed a lot of thorough consistency. Heirs didn't just appear like they used to. So he had opened the door with a bang to reveal a most curious of sights. Naruto tied to the bed with his shirt shredded, Hinata on top of him with her face a haze of red and tousled hair, her fingers tangled in the remains of his garment and her knee, and the groans. Uchihas didn't blush. It was somehow, in a freak mutatio. And that accompanies complete bastardization, left out of the DNA encoding process early on. So Sasuke Uchiha was not blushing. Hell no. He was merely, intensely unsettled, causing adrenaline to open blood vessels in his body and flush his face a slight red. It didn't take long for Naruto to realize that the situation he was in was not normal. Sasuke, he yelled, breaking away from the stone-stilled Hinata. As soon as their lips had made contact, all bodily functions had ceased and she was pronounced legally dead for at least the next 5 minutes to stare wide-eyed at the familiar intruder. Sasuke quickly averted his own eyes. No, he had not been caught staring. My apologies. For once in his life, the Uchiha had managed to utter a clear statement unmarred by hns, or just unintelligible. Due to the mumbling he was always doing. He turned briskly around, hand still firmly on the doorknob only now with knuckles very white, and was just about to leave and forget everything he'd just seen when Naruto's shrieks once again made him pause. Sasuke Anee. The Uchiha had whipped around again so fast that Naruto didn't even finish, only swallowed his cry and tried not to sweat his fear. Sasuke's eyes were a deep swirling crimson. Do not go there. The man grit out the sentence and Naruto flushed scarlet. Just who do you think I am, Tem? He sputtered, still unaware that Hinata still hadn't really taken a breath and that her face had gone from red to an alarming, yet somehow attractive color of purple. Sasuke cleared his throat and tried to turn around. I'll just go. Sasuke, just give me like 1 second to explain. It's not what you think it is, seriously, I mean, well it's not like Hinata and I don't Naruto. Uchihas don't blush. But all that adrenaline when your friend is beginning to dive into his sex life does do things to a person. She tied me up and interrogated me like a criminal. And then she said she was only 17 and that she doesn't remember her birthday last week or the one before or the one before or before. Now this was odd. Over the past few years, Sasuke Uchiha had gotten to know the Uga princess in ways he'd never even dreamt. For one, he actually talked to the woman on a daily basis because she seemed to be the only sane part of his relationships with Naruto. She was level-headed, sweet-tempered and all-around pleasant person. The exact opposite of the hog-tied, still knuckle-headed ninja splayed on his own bed. She was one that Sasuke tolerated only because he had to. Uchihas don't really make female friends. They marry. But when you're married to Sakura Haruno of all people, it's hard to imagine that the female gender is actually human and not some giant ball of Rajan energy and hormones half the time and then the seductive, sex kitten type the next. Sasuke figured his relationships with Hinata were pure research, just in case Sakura decided to come down to planet Sasuke anytime soon. And if there was anything Naruto wasn't, it was a liar. Sure, he was stupid, idiotic, maybe, and annoying as bloody hell, especially now that he was surpassing everyone in a way that even made Sasuke proud. He was always honest. Hinata never forgot anything. She remembered the most minuscule of items, tiny details that had completely eluded Sasuke even though they'd been right in front of him. Hell, he hadn't even told her he liked tomatoes, and the fact was sworn to be a secret whenever Sakura found out it was way outside the lines of, just my favorite food, but there they were. Sitting in the refrigerator of their sprawling house, just waiting. So the fact that 4 years that one with Hiyashi was so hellish it doesn't even count, had simply disappeared, causing usually super tranquil woman to go completely crazy and tie up the person she'd loved for practically her whole life and known inside and out and better than anyone and understood in ways Sasuke couldn't even fathom, was really weird. So weird that Sasuke actually decided to voice it. Are you serious? And when Naruto nodded, he looked directly at the beautiful woman who looked back at him with the eyes of a rabbit about to seriously get mauled by a bear. Hinata, do you really think you're only 17? Naruto rolled his eyes. Do you think I could have made that up? He shouted, only to be completely ignored. Hinata didn't respond, but instead uttered a sound along the lines of eep, followed by a yelp as she disintegrated on top of Naruto, completely unconscious. Sasuke didn't sigh, but he really felt like it. Couldn't he just have one normal day? Do something. Sasuke looked at the situation with tired eyes. He was only 22 himself, but good God, this was getting old. Sigh. In a few easy strides, Sasuke had gone to the bedside and gingerly scooped up the scantily clad woman, hauling her dead weight towards the bathroom before disappearing around the corner. Hinata drifted in and out. The waves pulsed around her and she curled in a tiny ball, floating. She didn't think about anything. Her mind was completely blank. Internally, Hinata knew herself very well. Nothing could get her here. That's why she never got sick very often. She knew that if it was within her she would be able to beat it. But now it seemed she was quite sick. It wasn't everyday T1 sees a Konoha missing nin in the bedroom of their best friend. A best friend who had only gone on that one silly little scroll mission to get away for a few days, to forget, occupy his time for a moment or two. And for what? To try to save a silly little girl. She tried to remember his smile, the way he lit up when they passed the scroll off to the elderly man, the way he had shaken out his hair when it had rained on them that late evening. Even in death he had been beautiful, she supposed. Always beautiful, even when he was stained with red and pale streaks of light. But now, she tried to focus on the images of before. Flickers of Naruto were so evident within the actor's face. The whiskers, the way he'd briefly smiled at her. It was like every fantasy she'd ever dreamed had suddenly and literally come true. And frightened her beyond reason. She blushed and put 2 fingers gently to her mouth, tracing. He'd stolen her first kiss. A tug of her lips. He'd tasted like warm weather. And hot days and rain that steamed on rooftops in the summer. The fingers gradually fell away, a new sight emerging, breathing life and color. A ripple cascaded through the stillness of her lake. Glaw. SSY eyes traced light on a murky horizon, growing, forming. She was entranced. Her hair wafted round her head in smooth purple strands, bubbles still leaking. Mama. Hinata stared before her, into the depths. Mama. Mama, look. He was short and chubby, his tiny hands reached up at her, a smile she couldn't help but recognize plastered to a face she'd seen a million times. Her father's face. Messy. Black hair every which way and that beautiful smile. His smile. Mama. She reached her naked hand out. Oh, if she could only touch him, this angel. For a split second her hand distended through the water and into warm air. And just as she had treaded the pads over his smooth cheek he faded. But something was stirring deep in her, and she didn't know what. It was so strange, even though she'd never seen the child before in her life. She knew him. She knew him, and she loved him. Her heart had practically driven from her chest when she'd touched him, as though the very action was so right and perfect. She trembled. She didn't know. She didn't understand, but in other ways she did know. Like something kind of made sense now. Hinata didn't know if she was crying or not, for she was no longer in the water. But in a heavy fall of icy cold rain. She was still shaking, processing the image. Her eyes had stared back at her in that pretty face. Her eyes. Hinata sputtered and coughed as the Eevee spray of water from the shower blasted down on her. She shrieked at the cold and reached blindly for the source, hands finding cold metal and twisting sharply. She panted, her shoulders heaving and blinked away the drops collecting on her eyelashes. Eyes were on her. She didn't seem to be familiar with the bathtub, and though she'd secretly been hoping after all these scary visions and Unex's Nabal events she might actually wake up where she was supposed to be, but fate seemed to deal her another card. She slowly turned her head over her shoulder, to be met by what she'd expected to see. Naruto and Sasuke. The former of the two looking hopelessly concerned, now wearing a new shirt, the other looking truly Sasuke-like, completely bored. She swallowed heavily and stood up, pushing past the two and dripping water on the tiles. Walking to the wall-length mirror. Behind her she heard some kind of, whispered, interaction. I told you we should have used warm water. She looks freezing. It worked, didn't it? Then the conversation dulled and Hinata ignored them, too fascinated with her image in the mirror. She was not taller, but her hair was so long she barely could believe it. She lifted the strands up and blinked. Then moved her gaze to the rest of her. Her face was pretty, beautiful even in a pale, shy way. Her eyes were still the same milky violet, her skin still flawlessly white and soft, if not a bit thinner. And thank God her chest had finally gotten balanced with the rest of her. She closed her eyes and opened them again. The same. She took a deep, deep breath and looked at the two still bickering in the reflection. It was really Naruto and Sasuke, in the flesh. There was no other explanation. Hinata was forced to swallow this pill, and though it made absolutely no sense, she somehow managed to accept it. She was now 5 years ahead. How she got there was another story she couldn't even begin to answer, but for now she was waking up with Naruto and Sasuke was back to being himself. And Hinata really was 22 years old. 5 years had passed and she didn't even know where to begin. Hinata had never been so scared in her entire life. That was when Hinata finally noticed one tiny little detail that had escaped her totally before. A silver ring with a solitary diamond glittered on her finger. The finger. No, it can't be, she mumbled, staring at the evil, beautiful little piece of ring. The two stopped and stared at her. Hina-chan, you okay? She turned around and faced him, dangling the ring in front of her like it was poison. We're married. Hinata gaped at the ring and then back to Naruto, who was smiling unsurely, and Sasuke, whose bored expression had peaked to one of slight interest. Just how much sake did I drink last night, Naruto? She managed to stutter out before collapsing back against the countertop, her hand raking through her hair. Naruto smiled again, a little more. Well, enough to make you, well, you know, crazy. She rubbed the bridge of her nose and moaned. He stopped smiling and his face turned to concern. Hinata, are you okay? Do you want me to call Sakura or something? Her head shot up. Sakura. Yeah, she'd completely forgotten. There wasn't just Naruto and Sasuke. There was a whole village. A whole village that had 5 years of something she didn't. Suddenly the whole Naruto thing didn't seem that big anymore. What was big was the Hyuga clan and who was running it, and where everyone was, and was everyone alive and gotten. Hinata was out of the bathroom in a flash and ran to the window she'd seen before. Throwing open the curtains and peering out, the first thing she saw was, oh my, what is it? Do you remember? She shook her head. Naruto, you're the Hokage. She didn't get an answer. Only a sad whimper. Hinata, I thought you'd at least remember that. Hinata backed away from the window, displaying such alien images of a beautiful lawn and the towering monument with Naruto's stone face. 5 years. 5 whole years. Hinata was stuck in the future with no way out. Married to Naruto, who was the Hokage. And God only knew what else. Hinata's stoma. Was now located somewhere around her knees. She didn't need Sakura to tell her that either, even though the woman was still examining her gingerly, her warm hands tilting her chin to look into her eyes with that funny-looking instrument. Any loss or blurring of your vision? Hinata's voice was lodged nicely in the very bottom of her throat, only surfacing as a weak whisper. No ma'am. Sakura raised a cotton candy eyebrow and took another sideways glance at Naruto, who was pacing frantically outside the room. Sighing, she stepped back and looked at Hinata, concern lacing her features. Hinata, you don't have to call me ma'am. I'm only 22, for God's sakes. Hinata let her eyes dance to the floor, feeling rather embarrassed as Sakura turned around and rifled through some drawers and put away things on the counter. Hinata squeezed her hands together on the examination table and the pinkett continued with a tiny laugh. So Naruto kept going on about you bumping your head this morning. You two must have been busy last night. Hinata flushed fire red and blinked, still staring at the tiles, willing them to swallow them whole. Sakura turned around and noticed immediately, a coy smile gracing her features. Don't worry, I'm sure he's just exaggerating about the whole memory loss thing, he's such an idiot. Sakura put her hand on Hinata's head, feeling everywhere until she'd found the ginger spot from that morning's escapades. So, tell me why you come in here so early for. You look absolutely fine. Hinata breathed heavily. Sakura-san. I think that's something is wrong with me. Sakura stopped feeling Hinata's head and looked at the kunoichi severely. Hinata, I told you not to worry about that. It's just going to take time for you too. It's not like it'll never happen. She smiled warmly. I'm sure Naruto understands perfectly that it's not your fault. Hinata's brow furrowed in confusion. What? Am I sick? What isn't my fault? Sakura's smile dropped. Hinata, why have you been stuttering so much? You grew out of that years ago. And what do you mean, what? You've been having trouble for the last year. Hinata felt swells of worry in her chest. Trouble with what? Exclamation mark quote. She practically cried, as if maybe the secret could hold some kind of answer to the chaos she was in right now. Sakura stopped touching her altogether and her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Okay. Just what is going on here? Naruto calls me at 10 in the morning when he should be at the tower going on about some kind of amnesia nonsense and then you show up looking perfectly normal. That's just it. Hinata cried staring at the woman who had been so beautiful. Hinata could barely talk to her. I don't remember anything. I woke up 22. W woke up 5 years older. Sakura stared at Hinata very carefully, a very, very long silence enveloping the two before Sakura finally spoke, weighing her words heavily. You mean to say that you woke up 22 and went to bed 17. Is that really what you just told me? Hinata flushed, but nodded her head shamefully. No it sounds insane. She mumbled, wiping away a few tears, but it's true. And I feel so overwhelmed. Her words disintegrated into tears as she held her hand to her face. Meanwhile, Sakura's medic intuition was clearly telling her that this was not just a story. The obvious distress of her patient, the reverting to old speech patterns, obvious unknowing of a very important issue that had been addressed only days ago. Sakura analyzed Hinata closely. Her behavior was like that of patients when they just wake up from anesthesia. She kept looking at her hands, looking at Sakura, then just looking at her hands again, eyes wide and clouded. It's not insane. I've heard of some crazier things around here. Hinata barely lifted her head, her hand dropping away to reveal eyes that were so frightened and so hopeless, eyes she'd seen in the turbulent, emotional years of Hinata's youth. It was like looking at Hinata at 16, her heart breaking slowly under pressures and pains from her family and untold wants and needs she'd never allowed herself. Sakura put a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it all out. She said softly, and Hinata's lips trembled as more tears leaked anyway, brushed hastily with the back of her hands. Thank you, she whispered in reply, but Sakura could hear the tones of not being totally convinced. I bet that idiot didn't even try to believe you, did he? He just let you run wild without even trying to help. At least he brought you here. Now we can actually do something. Hinata blushed slightly and sniffed. I sort of thought he was an imposter. She said weakly, and Sakura looked at her sternly. Don't even think that way. None of this is your fault. You are the victim here, and should have been treated with respect. Hinata looked fearfully at the woman Sakura had become. She was still petite, but she was just as fierce as ever with those beautiful pink tresses. She had traded her short locks for something a bit longer, resting just on her shoulders and halfway pulled back so that only a few bits touched her cheeks, framing the doll-like face. Her eyes were a flashing jade and they were very determined as she began moving about, pulling out files and forms. Hinata wondered how was that one woman could make a simple white lab coat look so amazing. First things first, we'll need to get all the details of what you were doing before all of this on paper. That way we may get some kind of answer. Then we'll start a few diagnostics, just to see how your brain is managing and if it's just temporary or not. Then we'll go see about finding an answer to how to get you right again. Oh, she suddenly stopped and looked at Hinata with a great deal of sympathy. You probably have no idea what's going on here, do you? Well, we'll fix that. I'll get Ino over here and she'll tell you everything about anything you want to know. Sound okay? That way you won't be so lost. Hinata nodded weakly, feeling a little relieved for once. Even if it was Ino, and even if the facts might just be warped a little, she could use some explanations. Why yes. Thank you. Sakura smiled warmly and felt as though she was playing mother hen to a very lost little girl. We'll get it all sorted out. I make a point that failure is no option. This made the girl twitch with a smile and she nodded thankfully. Thank you. Sakura smiled and motioned for Hinata to get up off the table, and showed her to the door. Once it had opened, Naruto stared at them both, his expression hopeful. He strode briskly towards Hinata and crushed her in a hug. Hinata's heart was pounding through her chest, and her arms were stiffly held beside her as he nuzzled her neck, spreading the smell of sun-warmed grass all throughout her body. With his arms still around her, he looked up at Sakura, his frame still a good means taller than her. Her head tucked right under his chin. Is she all right now? Does she remember? Sakura rolled her eyes and used her clipboard to enthusiastically beat the man away from the statuesque woman. As he retreated, she put a protective arm in front of Hinata, guarding her. Naruto, this is no easy fix. She honestly is not 22. Just look at her and tell me she's who she was last night. Naruto looked worriedly at Hinata, walking a few steps closer. As he looked, Hinata's eyes stared into his, still blushing mad. Sakura looked away as pain filled his expression, her own heart constricting painfully. Why was it always Naruto? Oh Hinata, he murmured, and for a moment his hand twitched towards her, but her eyes widened in surprise and she flushed again. The hand quit moving and Naruto put on a masking smile. Don't worry Hinata, I won't let anything ever happen to you. I promised and I'm going to keep it. It doesn't matter how old you are, you're still Hinata. He looked at Sakura then. And Hinata saw a side of Naruto she'd never really seen before. If anything happens to her, I'll have your head Sakura-chan. His eyes slid from blue to crimson and Sakura only smiled. Her eyes closing as she put her arm on Hinata's shoulder, turning them both around. Hi Hokage-sama. She'll be in good hands. Hinata looked briefly over her shoulder to see he was gone. Only a flutter of air and nothing more. For the next 3 hours Hinata was seated in a hard chair in Shikamaru Nara's office, recounting in heavy detail every last moment of her time before reaching this point. It was very emotional and several times she couldn't speak without crying, but a box of tissues was readily available and no one seemed to judge her otherwise. Sakura sat next to her, coaxing her along through the stories while Shikamaru questioned her with interest, obviously thinking deeply on the situation. After what seemed like ages, Hinata was finally done and Shikamaru was just thinking while Sakura inspected her fingernails. You said the last thing you physically did was activate your Byakugan, correct? Hinata looked up from the tissue she was balling in her hands and nodded. Yes, I think it must have been a reflex. He agreed silently. Yes, well, he yawned and Sakura glared at him. He covered his mouth and swallowed the tiredness, looking at them both with lidded dark eyes. Bloodline limits are tricky. Sadly, I don't have much experience in that field seeing as I'm not an Uchiha or a Hyuga, or whatnot, but there's someone who's very familiar with those. He leaned back in his chair, pushing his hands behind his head and Sakura's eyes narrowed. You know how Hiashi treats Hinata. Shikamaru opened one eye and rolled it, and Hinata perked up a bit. Hands clenching the tissue balled between them. Everyone knows that woman. I meant Kakashi. He sat up and put a hand on the desk, standing up and stretching. If anyone has something to add to this it's Kakashi. Didn't you say he could open that vortex thing or something? He should be an expert on weird by now. Sakura turned his words over. I suppose. But who says he's going to cooperate? Shikamaru chuckled. Woman, you need to get out of the hospital more. Kakashi Hatake does 2 things nowadays, drink sake and read. Naruto only makes him take 1 or 2 missions every month because he has gets stir crazy and causes him trouble. Sakura smiled warmly. That's Kakashi for you. Well, thank you, we'll get right on that. Shikamaru nodded, waving his hand casually. As Sakura helped Hinata up from her seat, she looked at Shikamaru and then at the door. The boy hadn't really changed much. He was still the most intelligent person she knew, and by far the sleepiest. She smiled a little. Maybe things weren't as different as she thought. Did you see that Hinata? Shikamaru was practically asleep. Hinata nodded shyly and walked closely to Sakura, who had traded her lab coat at the door and was now sporting a simple outfit of cherry red and beige. Hinata did not miss the large Uchiha symbol on her back, either, but somehow it seemed to fit. Hinata didn't bother to think about her own clothes or the white swirl that adorned them. In truth, she'd been somewhat happy with her wardrobe of simple fabrics and sensible cuts. She'd always been a modest girl, and now she seemed to hold herself in a reserved but attractive way. As for Shikamaru, he had seemed rather sleepy, sleepier than usual. Sakura noticed her questioning gaze and laughed loudly. Shikamaru married a Suna kunoichi named Tamari about 3 years ago. For a long time no one thought they'd get married, they fought so much, but now it's easy to see they've been quite busy. Hinata blushed again at the last statement and Sakura chuckled lightly again. And here she'd thought Ino would always fall for the lazy ninja with a handsome smirk. Ana Ino-chan? She asked out loud, on the subject of the Shika Ino-cho formation. Sakura smiled lightly and turned to Hinata, her eyes sparkling. She and Choji have been engaged for years. Seems Ino just can't accept marriage. She says it makes her feel like an old maid. Choji seems perfectly fine with it, seeing as they really don't have much eyes for anyone else but each other. Sakura put her hands behind her back as they walked, passing and going into shops like they had 5 years ago. Only it seemed that a little bit of tiredness had disappeared from everyone's eyes, like everyone was relieved or had taken a good breath recently. Like everyone had a reason to be happy. Naruto is a good Hokage. She said softly, remembering the protective way he'd stared at her, even though it was only Sakura. The girl smiled quietly, but Hinata could feel nothing but raw pride rolling off of her body. Hi, he's excellent. The best in all the ages, they say. She turned to Hinata and tilted her head, and no one is prouder than you. Hinata smiled a little. Yes, she thought, I would be. On the subject of you and Naruto, I'm assuming you've already discovered your marital status, of course. Hinata nodded somberly, deflating just a little. Yes, I found out this morning after they turned the shower on me. Sakura stopped walking. What? Hinata poked her fingers nervously together, feeling very much under the spotlight. Well, Naruto and SSSSSS. She found the name made her tongue thick. Sakura smirked. Sasuke. Hi. Sasuke-san used the shower to make me conscious again. Conscious? Did you faint? You haven't fainted in years. Hinata nodded again and Sakura began walking, sighing as she went. They're two of the biggest idiots in the world, no matter how old they get, to me at least. Hinata knew the kunoichi was just putting up a front though, her eyes were too happy to be sincere. Which made another question come to mind. Sakura-san, why you and Sasuke-san? Sakura blinked, calming out of her mind and tucked hair behind her head. Married for too long, which is really only 2 years. We also have a son, he's 17 months, his name's Hatsuharu. She smiled and her eyes took on a dreamy quality. He looks just like Sasuke, and he's so smart. She began to babble on about the boy and Hinata found herself smiling too as they walked. Sure, she was still rather rattled that Sakura and Sasuke had a child. But at the same time she could defiantly see that Sakura was probably the proudest mother in Konoha, although she probably was going to get strict as time went on. Smiling until her name broke her out of her temporary happiness. Hinata-chan. Hinata stopped, the hair on the back of her neck raising just a fraction. Sakura turned around with a short, and then her eyes softened. Ah, Neji. You look well. Arigato, Sakura-san. Hinata's eyes were wide like dinner plates. She'd forgotten her cousin. Her cousin. She rigidly turned around, but she was unable to stop herself from looking because her fear was ebbing away and quickly becoming a frantic curiosity. What she saw was quite startling, and Hinata's mouth fell open without much warning. She barely believed what she was seeing. The first thing Hinata really registered was Neji's face. And the smile that was glued to it. And not the smile he used at home to put her at ease, the smile that NLY pretended to be happy so maybe she'd have one less thing to worry about, but a true one that covered the smooth planes of his chin and cheeks. Or what used to be smooth, for now it seemed a long jagged scar ran from his forehead to his chin, a deep slash she knew had taken more than only days to heal. It made his left eye droop sleepily, and his face was no longer so coldly aristocratic. It was warmer now, if not pleasant. Neji had always had the face of a soldier, cold and impassive, but now with the scar he seemed an honored veteran who'd earned it as valiantly as she could ever have imagined. Other than the obvious blemish he was completely the same, his hair was still long and smooth, braided loosely behind his back to keep it away from his eyes and the bandages he still wore round his forehead to cover his seal. He was dressed in a lofty tunic belted at his waist and dark pants, various buckles and straps holding it together in a vague resemblance of his old ensemble. His eyes looked at her with a distant fondness, like she was the little sister of a very good friend, only inches away from being his own, but still untouchable. And for some odd reason, Hinata did not look away from him as she normally did but stared directly into him, searching for the ultimate change in him that she could see without eyes. More surprising still was that she could not have thought him any other way but this one. He fit so perfectly, blending in around him with an ease she often tried to mimic, that she could not be as shocked as she'd really wanted to be. It was as if the very corners of her brain had pulled him into thin air saying, "This is what he will look like, this is what he will be like. We know." And it had come true. Chi-Chi. The voice was a whisper of violets on a fiel. D and Hinata's eyes were instantly pulled downwards at the sound, snapping her back to the present. It was a little boy looking at her very severely, tugging anxiously at Neji's sleeve and pointing at her as she stared. Hyuga eyes and a stern little face looked back at her. "Tetsuya, you should be silent when your father is speaking." Hinata watched the odd display as Neji put a large hand on the boy's milk chocolate hair, stroking so softly she might not have noticed the movement of his hands. The boy's mouth closed and he stood, staring at Hinata, with those wide eyes, almost expectant in his stance. Neji pulled his eyes away from the boy, who looked so much like Neji it couldn't have been anyone but his son, and back to Hinata. "How are you, Hinata? I feel like we haven't spoken for ages." Hinata shuddered at the thought as Neji's eyes probed hers, his hand still on his son's head, and she just blinked. Well. She kept staring at the child who was staring back, a queer look passing over his sharp little features as he opened his mouth again. "You're not my aunt." Sakura stopped smiling and stared at the boy, who couldn't have been older than 4, and Neji stopped speaking to Hinata and looked down at his son severely. "Tetsuya, that is no way to treat Hinata Haim. Do you hear? You are not to be so brash." The boy stared up at his father indigently and then raised one pale little hand. "That isn't Hinata Haim." Hinata stared at his accusing little finger and blushed scarlet. Had he really seen through her that easily? Neji gave another cold look to his son and bowed his head towards Hinata. "My apologies, Hinata. Tetsuya is at the age of speaking what's on his mind." If Hinata hadn't been so upset that she'd been found out by her 4-year-old nephew, she might have seen the tiny look of affection that pulled at Neji's mouth. But she was upset and found it rather hard to focus on a coherent thought as those scrutinizing eyes questioned her as violently as his little cunning voice did. "Who are you? Why do you look like my aunt? Where is she? Bring her back." Sakura smiled sheepishly and stole a nervous look at the dumbstruck Hinata. She looked as if she were about to cry. "Good grief. Told off by a 4-year-old, she mumbled, putting a protective hand on her shoulder, attempting to wake her up from her stupor. Neji pinched Tetsuya's arm through his Chinese shirt and the boy yelped. "That is enough, Tetsuya. Your mother and I will have to talk about this mouth of yours." The boy scowled and began to glare at the still quite frightened Hinata. Akira ran a hand through her hair and bowed towards Neji briefly. "Ah, it's quite all right. Hinata and I have an errand to run. Maybe she can stop by later this week, she's been a little sick." You eased Hinata's shoulder sharply and Hinata gasped so loud she began to cough, air running every which way through her body. The Hyuga prodigy nodded solemnly and gave Hinata a soft look. "Yes, Hinata Haim should take better care of herself. She's looking rather pale." Sakura smiled and gave a happy wave goodbye as the two disappeared within the crowds of people and then began to drag Hinata away from the spot she was glued. Still coughing like a crazy person. She did not see the little boy look back at her with wide eyes, as if he'd known something she had not. By the time they had reached the apartment building, Hinata had gotten herself composed, slightly. She was still frazzled and Sakura only shook her head as they climbed the stairs to Kakashi's flat, her heels clicking on the wood. And Hinata's own shoes making soft steps. Hinata could not seem to shake that very violated feeling she'd received looking at the creature that was her nephew. It was very discerning and Hinata could not help but feel like it was only the beginning of such a horrible sensation. But for the present, Hinata had familiar butterflies at seeing the daring shinobi she remembered as Kakashi. The one who Did as he pleased and went where the wind took him, who looked after people and himself like a friendly old man. She was almost unhappy with her amount of faith that he could cure her, like it was is interpreted omen that she should be so eager. Is Kakashi-sensei retired now? Hinata questioned as they went up yet another flight of stairs. Sakura laughed and shook her head between chuckles. Oh no, no. Kakashi's just slowed down enough to actually enjoy peace times. He's seen so many battles he feels like the world needs time to catch up with Kakashi. No, he's just taking a well-deserved vacation right now. They got off at a landing and Hinata followed Sakura as they wound through the hallways, passing doors and people as they went, mostly shinobi men she hadn't really ever seen before, but were being rather friendly. Ohio, Hinata Heim. How are you Hinata Heim? Hinata Heim, tell your husband I need a raise. They smiled broad grins and laughed lightly as they passed her, shedding compliments and sweet looks that had Sakura rolling her eyes. Naruto's barely been Hokage a year and they've got you on a pedestal, they think you're the sweetest thing to ever walk the earth. She said loud enough for an unsuspecting teenager to hear. He flashed a glance at Hinata and blushed, making Hinata dizzy with too much attention. Oh dear, she mumbled, almost running into the now stationary Sakura's back as they stood in front of a painted blue door. If one of them ever dared say that to me I'd knock them out so fast. Sakura continued, and Hinata pressed her fingers together nervously. They seemed nice. Only because they know your husband would cut their heads off if they so much as looked at you wrong, Hinata. Both women whirled around to see a very lax-looking Kakashi standing behind them. Looking not a day older than when Hinata had last seen him and still just as slick to have followed them silently along to his own door. He also seemed to be holding what looked like some groceries. A celery stick jutting from the top like a flag as they stood in the crowded little hall. Sakura looked displeased and moved aside, allowing the seasoned man to unlock the door, and Hinata only continued to blush perpetually. She seemed to be doing it so much she was surprised her nose hadn't started to bleed, and when the door swung open they all proceeded into the small, but clean apartment. It was rather sparse, but furnished with very strange little knickknacks and oddities from all over the ninja countries, figurines and mismatched tables and chairs. Corners and a large hand-woven wool rug sprawled out in the middle of the floor. Hinata admired all of them silently, drinking in the deep hues and forms of each one's unique appearance before wandering after the other two into the kitchen where Sakura was complaining passionately about Sasuke to Kakashi, who was putting away groceries with a lazy sort of grace. And then he tells me, I'll be back at 10. You could have at least phoned to tell me you'd all three gone out drinking like a couple of idiots. Hinata stood awkwardly in the midst of their conversation, feeling rather like a person left out of a very funny inside joke. I know you're not here to just talk, so why don't you tell me what you're doing here when it's my reading day? He said in a slow drawl, the lips beneath his mask moving slightly as he closed a last cupboard and faced the two kunoichi with looks of meager irritation. Sakura glared at her former sensei and then sighed, beckoning to Hinata, who shuffled shyly forward and looked at the tiles of Kakashi's kitchen. Take a look and tell me what you see. Sakura said seriously, making Hinata lift her head and stare at the hypnotizing gray eye before letting her own pale ones dart back to the floor. I see a very embarrassed Hinata. He replied matter-of-factly, leaning against a counter with his arms crossed, still inspecting her. One I haven't seen in a while, might I add. Sakura sighed again. Exactly. Hinata looked at Sakura this time, who was still staring at Kakashi, who was still staring at her. She woke up this morning with no recollection of the past 5 years and a rather interesting story as to why. A slender silver eyebrow moved in curiosity. Care to explain? Sakura nodded and proceeded to retell the detailed occurrences, paying special attention to the location, time of day and what had happened to Naruto. After a few minutes Kakashi nodded and then stared at Hinata thoughtfully. You say you were using your Byakugan moments before this all happened, correct? Hinata nodded shyly and Kakashi shrugged. I really don't know exactly, but if I had to bet, chakra deprivation seems to be the culprit. It does strange things to bloodlines like Sharingan and Byakugan. If I had to explain it better, it would be like running a machine with no gas, but the machine keeps going and doing what's told, making it malfunction and backfire. It's like the gears are moving, but they rub each other the wrong way and end up doing what they think is right but really isn't. Understand? Hinata nodded fearfully. Why yes B but T that M means. Kakashi nodded. If what you're saying is true, and I believe it is, then the chances of you getting back to normal are unpredictable if not never going to happen. You may go back in a month, you may in 10 years. We have no way of telling if you'll even go back at all. Overall it seems as if your Byakugan was pushed into seeing too far ahead as a result of stress and nothing left to keep it working properly. It was a violent reaction to keep you from dying. Dying. The word sounded strange. Hinata had never really been dying before. She stopped shaking and stared at the spot beside Kakashi's left arm. Just over his shoulder. Had she been so consumed with Naruto she hadn't even considered her own well-being. She had been dying. Of course Hinata. You were bleeding to death. Hinata didn't turn when Hinata made the remark plainly. I guess I didn't notice. Hinata said again, looking up with a soft smile. Well, at least I'm surrounded by people I know. Sakura nodded surely. And even though Kakashi also agreed he wasn't completely convinced that Hinata was as at ease as she let on. There was a depth of sadness to her eyes that he couldn't get out of his mind. Sakura however, took the slight uplifted attitude and ran with it. Yes, that's right Hinata, you're surrounded people who still care about you regardless of your age. Sure, a lot of things might be different. And yes you are married to Naruto, but you'll have nothing but support. Hinata let a little air out of her nose in a quiet laugh. Ah, thank you Sakura-san. Kakashi looked at her oddly and scratched his ear. If I were to guess, the 22-year-old Hinata is in you somewhere. The longer you stay here, the easier things should become. I wouldn't be surprised if you started remembering things within the next month or so. Sakura smiled again, even wider. Hear that Hinata? It's all going to get sorted out. Hinata nodded. She wasn't unconvinced, but something told her that things ran deeper than anyone might have imagined them to be, and that in this process she may just lose herself entirely. She couldn't shake it, just like she still couldn't get Tetsuya's eyes out of her head. The remainder of time was spent talking slowly, further evaluating at Kakashi's small table over tea. Mostly just little details taken into consideration, and also the reiteration of Naruto's state at the time. If he was dead then, why is he alive now? Sakura had asked, leaning her hand on her shoulder. Kakashi had given an intelligent smile beneath his mask. Who knows? Any number of things may have occurred. For Hinata, this may be one of thousands of possible futures. Or maybe a possible past. Sakura mused, biting the edge of her nail. Hinata was close to boiling over with information at this point and opted for a more tranquil state of twisting her glass between her hands. She was trying not to think about anything in particular, but Naruto's face kept appearing every time. Naruto. She sighed heavily and took a sip of her tea, an action that did not go unnoticed. It's getting late, Naruto should be home about now. Kakashi said vaguely, looking at the clock and then at Hinata who did not really react. Only paled a little more. Sakura stopped her thinking and sat up. Shit, I hadn't meant for us to stay so long Kakashi. Great, now I'll have to work in Hinata's tests tomorrow. Kakashi shrugged. No harm done. But as for your medical endeavors, it is my duty as Naruto's former sensei to make sure his property is kept in good state. I wouldn't do anything out of the ordinary if I were you. This all seems to be rather believable if you just talk to Hinata, and I'm sure Naruto won't want any further stress inflicted on her. He watched the look of gratitude cross Hinata's features at the prospect of some relief, and continued, smiling through his voice, if I were Hinata I would stay inside all day and do nothing tomorrow. Sakura's face softened she looked at Hinata's face which was now starting to protest. Oh no I see couldn't. I'm not used to doing nothing. Sakura laughed. Consider it doctor's orders. Hinata smiled, defeated, and tiredly sipped her tea. It seemed she no longer had much say in just about anything at all anymore. Are you sure you don't want me to get Naruto away for a bit? He's going to hound you something awful as soon as you walk in. Hinata shook her head from side to side, standing in front of the foreign house with huge spreads of flowers covering the lawn. Sakura had been very accommodating in her endeavors to make Hinata's life easier thus far, but asking the Hokage to leave his house was just one thing Hinata would not allow. Sakura blinked and nodded soundly. Hi. If you need anything just call me. My number's got to be in that house somewhere. Hinata nodded again, too weary to reply, and watched the pink-haired Kunoichi walk down the path with a small wave. She followed the Dr. Her eyes all the way down the road where the low walls met the main street. A figure was standing near a bench in the distance, and as she approached she held out her arms. Sasuke neatly passed a squirming boy to her. Hinata felt the stir in her heart. Suddenly, the air smelled like milk and sugar, and the breeze whispering through a tall cherry tree near the house corner sounded like laughter. She looked at the door to the house. The house shared with Naruto Uzumaki as of this morning. 5 years was such an awfully long time, but she had to begin somewhere. A light flickered on in the bedroom she recognized from this morning. Beat, beat, thump, thump, thump. Her heart was beginning to hammer. 5 years, starting with one night alone with the one person she'd loved for a million years. She thought of all the questions she'd patiently saved in her head. There were hundreds of them, and she'd saved them all for now. I'm horrible, she whispered to the quiet dusk. I'm so selfish to ask so much of him now. It's like taking advantage. It was true. She was being horribly selfish because with the realization of her death came the realization that Naruto was hers in this place. She would get to be alone with him. Talk with him, maybe even, she blushed. Don't even think about that. She reprimanded herself, dispelling the image of Naruto without his shirt, beneath her body. In truth she wanted him to make everything alright, to make everything better, and answer all her questions. She may be so nervous she might faint, but she would try. She would try very hard and make the feeling last. Ha ha. Hinata is allowed to be 17, isn't she? She was never going to forget anything after this. She would die again before she forgot what it was like being married to Naruto Uzumaki. And she was going to get the story from his mouth, no one else's. He would tell her about them. She would start tonight with easy things and build up. She was not going to rush this like a silly little girl, oh no. She was going to make it last, even if it killed her. And her reason behind this sudden change of attitude in an otherwise hopelessly cowardice heroine. Simple. If this was Hinata's body's way of keeping her alive, then she damn sure deserved payment for all the trouble. A happy ending seemed to cover all the cost, plus the interest of losing an arm. If Hinata was stuck, she was not going to suffer. For the first time that day, Hinata actually got to appreciate something. She wasn't one for material things, but this house was beautiful. The front door was unlocked. Ed and she was greeted inside by a welcoming rug and several potted flowers, their colors bursting in the traditional neutral palette of the rooms. She had removed her shoes and taken a pair of slippers that must have been her own from the spot in the corner and stepped up into the house with a feeling of horrible apprehension. Naruto, she called out hoarsely, holding her arms around herself, protectively as she stood in the middle of the open living room. She felt like an intruding stranger standing on the glossy wood floors, feeling too awkward to sit on the tan couch or even turn on the switch that led to a hanging teal lantern. So strange it felt to stand in that room. Gimme 5 minutes. She heard his voice appear to her right and turned slowly to face him. He was leaning out of the door to the bedroom. A tired smile on his face as he spoke. I hate wearing work clothes around the house. She let her eyes wander over his long Hokage's robes. Red and white, flames accenting the bottom as she'd seen a million times. She nodded. That's fine. He grinned again and disappeared into the room, the door sliding shut. Just cut loose, Hina-chan, it is your house after all. She heard his muffled voice again through the door and blushed. Yes, her house. She looked around her and wandered through another doorway, coming to a bright kitchen. Tea, she mumbled, walking to the counters and perusing the stove. A little kettle stood soundly on the burner, just as she must have left it a million times. She picked it up gingerly, its weight a comfort in her hands, and slid towards the sink. Before long her task was over, and also her feelings of being involved with the house, and she could only stand and watch the water boil, then brew tea, then pour it in steaming mugs she'd found in some obscure cabinet above her head. She had been so consumed with her task that the ticking of the clock on the wall barely registered with her, and it was far longer than 5 minutes later that Naruto came ambling in. Stretching his tan arms above his head liberally. She fought every nerve to not watch him as he sat down cross-legged on the floor, leaning his hands on the tab in front of him and stared at a vase of flowers in its center. See careful. It's still hot. She mumbled, setting the mug down before him, disrupting his thoughts momentarily to stare through. The wafts of steam ended her pink face. She held her own mug tightly in her hands, twisting it when she sat down across from him, staring at the wood instead of him. He frowned a little, but was also somewhat comforted. He may have been a few years ahead of her, but Hinata was still definitely Hinata. It was comically evident in the little mannerisms that were untouched by time or space, the way she twisted her mug for instance. Or the way he knew she was curling and uncurling her toes under the table. I heard you talked with Kakashi today. Did you find out anything? Hinata raised her eyes to the man before her. He was desperate for information, she could see it in his face. Naruto always was rather open about his dislike for being out of the loop, a fact she was happy to see hadn't changed. In a manner of speaking. I am stuck here. She stuttered, trying to keep eye contact with him as she spoke. His face fell severely. Stuck. Hinata felt panic set in as she realized what she had said. Oh no, it's not that I'm unhappy, it's well, I don't have a way out you see. She stopped her rambling apology as his whiskers stretched back to allow a large grin. Good. I was worried you were. Especially after this morning. Hinata blushed heavily. I'm so sorry I did that to you. I should have listened to you and not jumped to such an irrational conclusion. Naruto shrugged and through her hair she saw him rest his head again on his fist and sip his tea, eyes closing in satisfaction. Ooh, I'm so glad you remember how to cook. He exclaimed passionately, taking another long draught. She had to laugh at his exuberance and when she did he stopped drinking and smiled. So glad I get to hear that too, though I get the feeling I'm going to be missing it a lot. She stopped laughing and he stopped smiling and they just stared at each other for an immeasurable moment of time before Naruto reached forward and began fiddling with a loose petal from the vase, Hinata twisting her mug. She swallowed thickly, holding her breath, gathering her courage. She had made him upset, she could see. No doubt the sadness in the corners of his eyes and mouth were for her alone. A fact she couldn't bear to think about. So she decided that for tonight she might at least ask one question that had been brewing heavily in her head all day. Naruto. He lifted his head and gazed at her expectantly. She took a deep breath and looked down into the depths of her tea, ripples appearing as she moved the cup in little smooth curves. How did we? How did it all? She was blushing darkly, she could feel it as she tried out the horrible question. She looked up at Naruto, pleading for help. How did we meet? She nodded pathetically. Why yes. He smiled widely and the happiness in her eyes at her interest sparked a dull thrum of her heart she hadn't expected. He scratched his head, letting his fingers comb through his heavy gold spikes and thought. Looking at the wall with a small smile. Oh yeah, that's right, began, but his face was rather sheepish as he looked at her. I ruined your flowers. Damn dog. If there was one thing on the planet that Naruto hated about being that nice boy, it was the fact he was exploited by a Mrs. Uzumari on a monthly basis. Once a month, Mrs. Uzumari left the house unattended and Kai-chan, the obnoxious Pomeranian he'd come to so passionately hate, escaped through her kitchen door and ended up in the most inconvenient of places. There were shinobi by the dozens that she could have selected to retrieve said dog, but no. Naruto was the nice boy, the one who weeded her garden for small change when he was a kid and painted a fence for her once when he was 14. Now, at age 18.5 he was chasing her dog at a heavy sprint through the city, tripping over toppled carts and knocking people down in a mad attempt to catch him. Most of the time he caused enough chaos for 6 of Kakashi's hounds. Rushing into stores and under carts, flying into heaps of displays and knocking fruit all over the road. Once he'd even managed all the way down to the Uchiha district, airing through old abandoned buildings until Naruto had finally lost his energy and called Sasuke to come help him. Needless to say, the Uchiha had not been very happy. And who could forget the time he ran to the tower? The whole place had been up in arms until Tsunade had come storming out of her office, holding the shrieking dog by the scruff of its puffy neck with eyes that were ready to dissolve off Naruto's face. I'm going to kill that mutt. Naruto cried, leaping over a crate of chickens and dashing further into the village. He was a Junin for Kami's sake, months away from being an Anbu. He should at least be able to catch a stupid dog. But there was just one problem. This time, Kai had taken a turn for the worst possible place Naruto could ever be expected to go running into head first. The formidable, sprawling, Hyuga compound. Hinata loved flowers. There was something about having them grow before her eyes as plucky little seedlings to tall and graceful blooms that made her smile and feel giddy inside. A feeling hardly found at home. After all, potential heiresses were not allowed to be giddy. So when she'd come across the half-abandoned scrap of garden where her and mother had once tended lush swaths of greenery, Hinata was only too eager to overtake the project left behind. Thus, she'd secretly begun rejuvenating the little plot, nursing it back into life over many springs and a half of her summer. She couldn't begin to count the number of times she'd killed something. Sometimes she was so desperate for them to grow she overfed and overwatered them. Unlike cooking, gardening had not come naturally and she'd sweat out many a frustration on her knees, caked in dirt and fertilizer. Not to mention the bee stings, although Shino had provided more than enough help with that. She wasn't entirely sure what he'd done exactly, but within a day the bees only buzzed around sleepily, not even bothering to look her way. Now, finally, after weeks of failures, ND practice and research she had done it, she'd planted irises, and they'd rooted. Irises were her favorites. They were ruffled and full and beautiful and came in enough colors to keep her forever satisfied. They were her children of sorts and she'd labored intensely for the weak, but determined blooms that had wrestled their ways up despite her lack of talent. They were perfect, though a little small. And though they were dwarfed by other flowers she'd planted and not quite as vibrant, they were hers and she'd stop at nothing to see them continue to grow. But for Hinata Hyuga, life never turned out exactly as she'd planned. And this time was no exception at all. She'd retreated to the house for only a second. Only a second. She'd only just celebrated the small victory over something as silly as irises. Maybe she'd been too proud. She was humming one of the old songs her mother used to sing with words that didn't rhyme and tunes that lilted and slid and talked of love and war and nights and stars. She rounded the bend to her garden, though pathetic it was, and opened her eyes to see the apparent joy. And the gleaming new spade dropped from her hand. Naruto Uzumaki was wrestling on the ground, with a dog. Yes, the small puff of snarling, snapping fur was a dog. You bastard. Next time I'll tie your legs together and drop you in the river. And they were. My. Hinata didn't find the words as she stared at the horribly crippled bodies, the carnage and destruction. Her garden was ruined, all her irises uprooted in mounds of dirt and severed petal limbs. No battlefield had ever seen such horrors. And in the center, now stuffing the dog triumphantly into a netted bag, was none other than Naruto. Moments passed, and Hinata was still speechless. How? Oh, how? She had only turned her back for a second. Just a second to get the brand new spade from her bedroom, hidden under her best kimonos in the armoire. Finally Naruto looked up, satisfied and gleaming with sweat and smears of dirt. Coming face to face with Hinata. Hinata tried not to look self-conscious as she sat on the stool at Ichiraku's, sliding her chopsticks in and out of the paper. She didn't go out very often. In fact now she hardly left the compound due to etiquette and diplomacy lessons, not to mention mounds of clan history and the endless ceremonies she had to attend just to be considered Hyuga leader material. And now she was sitting at the ramen stand with Naruto, watching people pass by in crowds of lantern-hazed chatter. The blonde boy looked at her guiltily. Maybe ramen wasn't going to be enough this time. I'm really sorry about those flowers, Hinata. I figured they were just one of your uptight relatives, so. Hinata smiled weakly. It's okay. They weren't going to survive long anyway. She said, resuming her movements with the chopsticks and their paper wrapper. Naruto looked sheepish and then stared at the counter for a few minutes before flashing another look at the clearly still upset girl. Why did his stomach feel like lead? He really wasn't very used to making girls unhappy, or well, maybe it was just the sincere and honestly sad way Hinata was acting that got to him. Normally with Sakura she just punched him and got it over with, but Hinata was so quiet and she kept smiling at him like everything was okay, but it wasn't. He didn't like it. Not one bit. I'm going to make it up to you. Hinata looked up from her chopsticks and stared at the young man. He was reading straight into her eyes. I'm going to do anything you say to make it up. I'll plant anything, I'll take you out for ramen. You worked really hard on that garden and it was really important to you, so I'm going to make sure I make everything right. He left out the fact that seeing her face so pitifully sad made his insides twist up in a knot. She stared at him in awe and then looked down at her hands, flushing. "Why you don't have to do that much," she whispered, curling her fingers around the chopsticks. "I'd never ask so much from you. I know you're busy Naruto-kun." Naruto shook his head. "None of that. I'll make time Hinata-chan. I promise." She blushed heavier and swallowed, curling her hands even tighter. She could feel him watching her with those eyes of his, peering deep down into her heart. She tried to form a coherent thought, but only raised her head slightly. "Thank you." She mumbled, and he smiled that heartbreaker smile, about to reply before the bowls were sent down the counter by the sweet-looking girl to the right, and Naruto was of course hopelessly distracted. Naruto could clearly see her in his head, blushing mad and a mass of silly stutters and cute, shy words. Clusters of dirt caked to his hands as he toiled passionately over that little garden. And in the end only able to manage a few sturdy buds. He remembered the way she'd stared at him in utter disbelief when he'd sat amidst the wreckage with the squirming dog, Elong, and shouted apology he'd delivered as she'd started to tear up. The way she'd looked at him despite her sadness, as if he could never truly do any wrong to her. The way his words never came out just right after that. The way they ran together a lot and he found he just kept talking about nothing. And she was so patient to listen. He'd never had that before, unending amounts of just listening. But he'd never seen her so happy, and he'd never talked to the Hyuga so much as he had over that little scrap of earth. And once he'd finished, he'd found out that he really hadn't meant to let it all go so soon. But that was a story for another day maybe. He didn't want to freak her out too much after all she'd been through today. His blue eyes shifted from the past to the present and lay themselves over to the other end of the table, expecting to say something to her. But the words stopped halfway. She was folded over the table, arms curled under her head. She breathed deeply in and out. A faint smile spread out over her pretty face. Naruto's heart melted at the cuteness. "Hinata," he laughed, standing up and stretching, "you'll be the death of me, sweetheart." The words hung in the air heavily. Naruto stopped stretching and returned his eyes to the sleeping girl. He realized slowly that his wife really wasn't in the room anymore. He got up and rummaged through the linen closet, walking back slowly to drape it over her back and remove the mug from her hands gently. Naruto stared at her for a very long time, trying to figure out why everything had happened the way it did. "I'll take care of you, Hina-chan. I promised," he whispered and turned off the light to the kitchen, disappearing into the dark. It was him. Hinata knew it was, even though she barely recognized him. He was smiling at her. Maybe that's what gave him away. He was smiling so big, and his arms were held lazily on the table. He must have been 16 or so, and very handsome with that same black-brown hair and eyes so identical to her own. My mother's eyes. But at the same time she didn't look like her. He looked like her father. But something else, his smile was so distinctly, the way his hair was so messy, his posture. "You can't stay mad, can you?" Why was she smiling hopelessly now? Like she really couldn't. She didn't even know what he'd done, but at the same time, she did. She reached her hand out, ruffling his hair. "You silly boy." Hinata woke up with a start, her head coming up off the table with a lurch. Her words still hung in her mouth, only now everything else had evaporated from her mind, leaving a haze of confusion in its wake. What?" she said hoarsely, staring around the room. "Oh, that's right." She was sitting at the table, covered in a brown blanket, her legs aching, something awful in her hands tingling from holding her head so long. She rubbed her eyes tiredly, blinking them open and looking around the room once more. Last night she'd been too tired to really take anything in. But now she could see it was a small and tidy kitchen with little touches of her and Naruto so easily missed now screaming out at her like beacons. They were little things. And if she hadn't been in the situation she was in she probably would have chosen to ignore them, but they were there all right. Things like the empty bowls in the sink and the frog-shaped clock on the windowsill. Things that felt like they belonged there, much unlike Hinata. Her eye caught sight of sea green drapes fluttering in the breeze and the sound of a paper falling to the floor from the door of the refrigerator. She watched it descend to the ground and stared at it cautiously before standing. Cringing at the stiffness of her legs she walked slowly towards the note, bending down and picking it up gingerly. It was written on plain white stationery, scrawled in a messy, hurried hand. Be back around 5. Food in fridge, and I know I'm forgetting something. Never mind. Naruto. Hi. Hinata stared at the small happy face with whiskers at the bottom and felt rather embarrassed by it all. In a weird way she felt like she was almost cheating on Naruto with herself. Sighing, Hinata walked across the kitchen, folding the note into her pocket, and stood at the patio door. Potted plants covered every possible space in the garden. She saw vegetables and flowers and vines hanging green tea. Tendrils from a lattice propped against a wall. In the farthest corner she saw the terracotta pot containing the tall slender flowers standing in the sun. Goodness, she mumbled, stepping backwards, tripping over a house shoe that had been hastily discarded by Naruto as he ran out the door. She picked it up and placed it beside her own, looking in wonder at the two pairs of slippers, one much bigger than the other. Shaking out her hair she hugged herself and stared about the house. It was tidy, comfortably cluttered with little odds and ends. She was surprised to find so many curios adorning shelves and bookcases. Obviously souvenirs from far-off excursions. The study she'd wandered into was small with beige floors and paneled walls. The drapes were pulled shut and when she opened them, the low desk and mounds of official paperwork made themselves known. Hinata looked around the room awkwardly. Naruto's study was surprisingly neat. She walked past rows of diplomacy books and even one on etiquette, books of shinobi law, and several others that were kept in Naruto's private collections. The gutsy ninja, Hinata said softly, pausing next to a particular book that had caught her attention. It was plain, nondescript and bound carefully. The title was odd and she had pulled it out of its nook before she had realized it. It was light in her hand and smelled like pipe tobacco. She carefully slipped a finger into it, the covers falling open in front of her. For a student, don't let them tell you you can't. Jiraiya sensei. Hinata stared at the printed words and gently closed the book, sliding it back into its place. For some reason, as soon as she'd opened her mouth she'd felt like she had intruded on something horribly intimate, something she shouldn't have seen. Stepping back from the bookcase Hinata took one final look around the shelves and one large book caught her attention. It was covered in brown linen with the word, Days, inked carefully on the side. In refined, but still obvious form of her handwriting. Hinata felt a stone descend in her stomach but pushed back her apprehension and reached eagerly for the book, pulling it quickly from its spot. Letting the heavy object rest in her arms, she went to the low desk and sat down, brushing the long hair out of her face, and laid the book gingerly in her lap. For an immeasurable moment her hands traced the covers, falling over the lettering and the soft corners worn with use. All at once she mustered her courage and carefully opened the book. It was an album. Oh, she whispered, eyes dancing as she stared at the first page of Polaroids. Hinata knew subconsciously she would come across bits and pieces that would be emotional, but never had she expected this. No, never this. Her shaking hands went out, disbelieving she was seeing photographic evidence of this life. The pictures were well taken, but to Hinata they were beautiful, incomparable, the most wonderful thing she'd ever seen. They were us, she said softly, tracing the figures in each photograph. Hinata was crying, not out of sadness, but the feeling of nostalgia that washed over her. The unthinkable feeling of seeing something you'd wanted to see after a very long time. Recovered pictures after a fire or a flood. The first page was 4 pictures, each within their own quadrant as different as the seasons. Though she couldn't have told you when or how, Hinata knew those photographs. They had been engraved in her mind a long time ago, a horrible case of déjà vu. A tear landed on the first one and she quickly wiped it off, hastily brushing away the others. Her thumb lingered over Naruto's form, stroking gently. He was sitting on the floor, but not any she'd seen in the house, putting on his boots. Just his boots. Just him smiling down at the straps, pulling them on in his mission clothes, weapons scattered round him. Completely unaware the photograph was being taken. Please bring him home safely. That was the caption underneath. Hinata felt warmth flood her heart. Please give me another rainy day this month. Hinata stared at her own image on the page, sitting in the bathtub with a book. She was smiling too, a wide grin that looked cheeky and cute. She'd never been like that before. She frantically turned more pages, Photographs of Naruto flying by, herself, Sakura and Sasuke, Ino, Sai, Kiba. Parties. And get-togethers, one that must have been girls' night out, another where almost every Konoha boy she knew were holding up team posters in blue or red, sashes tied round their heads. War paint on their faces. Even one of Gaara himself seated on the very same couch with Naruto, the one in the living room, both dressed so casually you might have thought them civilians. That one had no wish written below it, only a crude little smiley face and, diplomats at work, put underneath. But the rest all had some small plea in the white of each Polaroid. Please let Neji be glad more often. Besides a picture of her cousin sitting at her very own kitchen table with Tenten, both of them holding coffee mugs. Please let them heal quickly. Naruto, smiling up at her from a hospital bed. Sasuke beside him with a deck of cards spread in their hands. Sasuke's arm was in a sling. Please help Sakura find time. Sakura holding a baby, with a jet black mop on his head and coal eyes, on her hip. His hand fisting a piece of pink and Sakura grinning into a telephone, making a peace sign. Naruto holding a little boy with black-brown hair on his lap, a kunai held in Naruto's rough hands. The child staring in awe at the metal knife as Naruto presented it. Please make us a family. This was no ordinary album. No, it was a book of prayers. They were small, and sometimes silly. But they were penned with so much heart and love that Hinata could only marvel. Especially that last one. It stirred her heart in a way she didn't completely understand. Hinata stared at the little boy, who must have been Tetsuya. Until it flickered, like static. An image replaced. White eyes staring at her. She dropped the book like she'd been burned, shooting backwards with a gasp. Hinata felt her head spinning and touched her forehead. She felt sick, and dizzy and other fluish symptoms. Standing shakily she made her way to the nearest bathroom, slamming into a wall as she went. She almost didn't make in time as she emptied her stomach into the toilet, wiping her mouth and trembling. Then, as soon as it had happened, she felt better. Much better. She looked around the bathroom and rubbed her eyes. Water clung to the fingers. She panted slightly, leaning back against the edge of the tub before standing up and turning on the shower. She wanted to wash those eyes out of her head. Hinata was dripping wet as she stood in front of the door to the bedroom. Her toes uncurled and curled, weight shifting nervously onto each foot. She was not going to stare at the bed. She wasn't. Simply, wasn't. She went a little red as she looked at the tangles of sheets and a blanket half hanging off one side. Naruto must have forgotten to make it on his way out. Hinata held the towel firmly. She just needed some clothes. Just clothes. She was not going to go into the bathroom and snoop. She was not going to. Why did the room have to smell like him? She wasn't even in the room and the scent had hit her. It was impossible to concentrate with that smell all around. Just some clothes. She repeated out loud. Just clothes. My clothes. They belong to me. She took a tentative step into the room. My room. She said. My house. Naruto said so. Naruto's room. She squeaked, her face going horribly red, her eyes squeezing shut. Mine, and Naruto's, house. The word, gritted from her teeth and she sighed in exasperation, deflated. I'm never going to get through this. She moaned, holding her hands out as she felt around the room blindly. Once she reached the closet she opened her eyes again. And then it was only to determine that this was getting horribly impossible. She'd opened the wrong side. Inside was a messy array of clothing, all of it Naruto's. Smelling like Naruto. Looking like Naruto. Orange and black and, slam. Hinata shut the door and then moved her hand to the other side, pulling it open so fast it scared her. This time it was thankful. Why her own wardrobe, and with trembling fingers she reached out and selected something suitable and retreated from the room like lightning, the door crashing behind her. After the frightening encounter with the master bedroom, Hinata found herself confined mentally to the living room and kitchen. There, at the little table from last night Hinata ate a cold salad and leftovers, too exhausted to care very much at how good it was. She felt horrible. Every few minutes her head pounded and she knew if she ate anything more she was probably going to throw up again. She must have been getting the flu. But the feelings eventually passed and Hinata was left feeling out of place again. So she did the thing she always did to clear her head. She cleaned. Hinata also began to realize that her logic Rom the past carried over into the future, because it was getting really easy to find things like cleaning supplies or hair bands and even some pain reliever. She seemed to organize things the same way. So Hinata just followed her intuition when she needed to locate a sponge or some bleach. The kitchen had been the first. She took everything out of the refrigerator and scrubbed it till it shone, scoured the stove and bleached the sink pearly white before moving to the floors. She moved the table effortlessly and swept everything out onto the patio where she was momentarily distracted by wiping dirt off of pots. For the next 3 hours she turned the house upside down and then put it back again, making sure to steer clear of the study and the master suite. Those seemed off limits no matter how many times she tried to tell herself they weren't. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Hinata had completely and totally forgotten about Naruto's note, and when the man came in, Hinata was looking a bit worse for wear. Her hair was pulled back roughly, her clothes discarded for the rattiest t-shirt she could find, pants pulled off to make way for tight black shorts that had already been stained. Hinata had actually been quite pleased with herself for keeping such clothing, and judging by the chemical smell that seemed worn into the fabric, she'd used them often for the same purpose. And as an added bonus she'd come across them in the laundry room. But currently more important issues were at hand. I'm starving. Hinata stiffened at the sound and looked over her shoulder from W. Here she had been cleaning out under the TV cabinet, arranging videos and CDs alphabetically. She heard shoes being kicked off in the mud room, something heavy dropping to the floor, and was instantly on her feet standing in the middle of the living room. How was your DDD day? She half stuttered, half shouted due to nerves. The muffled grunt she got sounded very much like, "Hold on," and soon after a very dirty Naruto emerged. Gee goodness, Hinata said in surprise, taking in his rather disheveled appearance. Naruto cocked his head and then looked down at his clothes. Damn it, he muttered, brushing stray soil off of his shirt before looking back up at his rather unnerved wife. He grinned sheepishly, or at least tried to. He had a black eye and a split lip. I got into a bit of a fight on the way home. Hinata felt hair on the back of her neck rise and she lurched forward without thinking, rushing to inspect him. Are you all right? She exclaimed, worry creasing her forehead and painting her eyes. Naruto smiled and laughed. Hey, it's fine. I was just helping someone out. No harm done. He stopped laughing and smiled gently at Hinata's truly worried face. She nodded, still unconvinced though, and withdrew her hands from his arm. Apparently they'd gotten there, on their own. Are you hungry? She asked tentatively, and then Naruto's face lit up. Starved, he moaned. Meetings all day and they don't give you a single break to eat. He whimpered, rubbing his stomach with a pained look. Hinata giggled and awkwardly slipped past him into the kitchen. Wow, the house is spotless. Did you clean all day? He questioned, slipping down onto the floor at the table. Hinata nodded and watched as his face contorted and as he sat, hissing through his teeth. Are you sure you're okay? She asked quietly. Naruto opened one eye and cocked a half grin. Perfect actually. That stew smells like heaven. He closed his eyes and inhaled the simmering pot that been on the stove since that afternoon. Hinata was genius when came to using up food. She blushed and stirred it with the ladle before spooning a hearty portion into a pretty ceramic bowl. Why were you fighting? She asked, as casually as she could, spooning another bowl for herself. Naruto shrugged and tapped his fingers. Some young kid was getting himself into trouble. Can't have that. Hinata looked up and saw he was staring at her. She blinked and he raised an eyebrow at her. Is something wrong? She asked, bringing the bowls to the table. He started to chuckle and shook his head. Oh no. Just how silly the two of us must look. Right, Kakashi? Naruto suddenly turned his head to the window where lo and behold, the copycat nin was poised outside, nose buried in that trademark orange book. Hitaki-san, Hinata cried, jumping out of surprise. The man raised one lazy eyebrow and walked to the door where he promptly let himself in. You're quite the pair, that's for sure. Kakashi answered, sinking down to the table. Hinata just stared at him. How long had he been standing there? Had he been watching her all day? Oh, sorry. It's all right Hinata, no need to get so worked up. Kakashi eats with us on Wednesdays after he gets through talking at the tower. Hinata watched as Naruto scratched his head in thought. For some reason he always ends up getting more info. Are mashing out of the same people in one day than the amount I attempt to get all week. I do try, Kakashi said dryly, before turning to Hinata. You're the talk of the tower today. Apparently a vario. Nay thinks you've got some horrible disease. What? Hinata exclaimed just as Naruto looked up, a certain protectiveness crossing his features. Kakashi smirked under his mask. Seems Ino got wind why. Oh, you were at the hospital and when Sakura told her it was confidential, well, I'm sure you can imagine. Hinata paled. And you did what to defend her? Naruto said coarsely. Kakashi smiled. It's confidential, remember. Would you like some stew, Kakashi-sensei? Hinata said tiredly, to which Kakashi readily accepted. I would give my other eye for a bowl, as would half of Suna's since last time. Did they really? I didn't think they liked it that much. Naruto marveled, staring at his food. Hinata raised her head in confusion. She had since gotten up and gotten the scarecrow his stew when her question had arisen. Last time, Suna, she asked. Last time Gaara came to Konoha you ended up making beef stew for the entire embassy because the regular cook had the flu. Gaara asked for it all week too. Naruto recalled between spoonfuls. Kakashi nodded and continued. Anyway, after it became the next big dish in Suna. They asked for it so much you just gave them the recipe. Naruto laughed. You're probably the most popular wife in the shinobi world. Every time someone comes they always ask about you. Hinata blushed even more. I'm sure that's an exaggeration. She said humbly, setting down Kakashi's steaming bowl. You do wonders for the political world too, Hinata, what with all that Hyuga training. Naruto said casually as Kakashi pulled down his mask. Hinata really couldn't answer. After dinner, in the initial shock of seeing Kakashi Hataki's real face, Hinata had set about doing the dishes quickly while the two shinobi had openly discussed a fusion of local gossip and the political affairs circulating through the tower. Then Kakashi had left with a wave of his hand and Naruto standing at the door with a grin. May I look at your wounds? Hinata asked, voicing the worry that had been bothering her all night. Naruto looked exasperated. And here I thought you wouldn't remember. He pouted, plopping down by the table again. Hinata smiled. Naruto may have been grown up. But he still had a horribly childish personality, not that she minded at all. I'll be gentle, she said softly, pulling out a first aid kit that she'd found earlier in the day. Taking out rolls of gauze and some scissors she set about cleaning out the cut on his face, being as careful as she could. OWWW. Naruto groaned as the alcohol hit a knuckle he'd grazed on a brick wall. Hinata chuckled and wrapped his hand. Shish. Naruto closed his mouth and watched her work, taping up his face and hands. The kid, he was about to beat someone else up, some civilian boy. Naruto said matter-of-factly. Hinata looked up for a moment before moving up to the gash on his shoulder she'd just noticed. Naruto stared at her hands. I told him he should only beat up someone to watch his abilities, to which he told me he could kick my ass. I said I wasn't going to go easy on him, and I didn't, and he still hit the shit out of me. Naruto stiffened, his voice serious. I cut him up pretty bad. But it was only so that I could get him subdued. What did you do after that? Hinata asked naturally, actually forgetting to stutter. Something about his proximity, the tone of his voice. They were all almost familiar. Handed him over to Iruka. He's been staying there overnight for the past week. Sometimes he stays at Kakashi's too. Do you know this boy? Hinata looked up and Naruto's eyes were a bit clouded. But he nodded none the same. He's a street kid. I've been mentoring him as much as I can since he turned 12 2 years ago, but lately he's been getting more trouble than I can keep him out of. Frustrates the hell out of me. He's got enough potential to beat everyone I know. Hinata gave his arm one final once-over and began putting everything back inside the box. But he's got nobody. Hinata looked up from her work and stared at Naruto. He wasn't looking at her, but instead at his wrapped-up hands. Nobody's going to clean him up tonight, you know. Hinata nodded and Naruto smiled sadly. He's a good kid. He really is, he's just alone. He acts out for attention. Like you did. Naruto smiled wider. Just like me. Hinata placed the asked thing in the kit and closed the latch, thinking. You used to wish IW would acto out. She looked up briefly. F for attention, I am mean. Naruto smiled and patted her head. Well, you didn't have to for my attention. I love you just for being so wonderfully quiet. Hinata melted into the floor. The kid was scrawny, not just from awkward adolescence either, but the legitimate hunger kind of scrawny. He had wild spikes of honey for hair and some of the stormiest gray eyes Hinata had ever seen. And, he was being held in Naruto's, their, house, quite against his will. Looks like I did more damage than I thought. Naruto mused, looking at the horrible cut down his back. He smiled at the boy though, the fox-like grin spreading over his cheeks. You put up one hell of fight. The kid, whose name Hinata had come to find was in fact Sora, only scowled. Yeah, well, you're not walking around with a 3-inch gash in your back, now are you? He grit out as Hinata applied the peroxide and then the herbal remedy she'd concocted just for the occasion. Naruto's face became serious. You were going to mug that kid. Sora rolled his eyes. He owed me money. That isn't the point, Sora. If you ever intend on being a shinobi of my Konoha, you can kiss those kinds of juvenile antics goodbye. You are here to protect those people, not take from them. Hinata paused briefly from cutting the long strip of gauze, but thought against saying anything, opting for instead laying gingerly on his wound. He hissed and Naruto shook his head. Why did he owe you money, Sora? He said quietly. Sora looked to the left. He didn't. Naruto slammed his hand on the table and Hinata jumped, starting to wake up. The boy had been dropped off at the house at 11:30, just when Hinata was ready to go to bed. Iruka was beside himself, saying he'd been looking everywhere till he found him behind the old district of apartments that were about to be taken down. Broke down an entire chain-linked fence just to get in. Iruka exclaimed wildly, rubbing his forehead. You know, next time Sasuke isn't going to let him off so easily. Naruto had expressed the same feelings, pulling the irritated boy inside. Ordering he sit and let her have a concerned look at his back. Damn it, Sora. If you need to eat, you come to me. He shouted, staring him down, eyes brimming with compassion. Hinata witnessed something strange then, as she put tape on the gauze, feeling the ribs under his skin. Why didn't you just say you were hungry? Naruto pleaded, why didn't you just ask me? The boy began to tremble. I hate asking you for help. How am I supposed to be something if I have to ask for help? You of all people should know how that feels. To feel like an inconvenience. Naruto put a hand on the boy's shivering head. Have you eaten today? No. The voice was a whisper, and when he said it, the shaking increased. No, sir. Naruto sighed and looked at Hinata with a weak smile. You have plenty of that stew left, right? She nodded. He can have anything. I'll fix whatever he likes. She added, watching as Sora stared at the hands in his lap, fingers curling into his pants. She got up quickly, almost running to the kitchen, turning on the burner in a flash. She'd make him eat till he got sick, she was so worried for that poor boy. Behind her, she could hear Naruto talking to him soothingly, and the kid started to sound perkier as they conversed. I see you finally got the handle on that new jutsu. Incredible, by the way. Naruto said casually, scratching his head. Sora nodded. Yeah, I've been working on it. Haha. Don't I know it? Didn't even see it coming. Sora laughed in a hoarse voice as Naruto pointed out his black eye, one that, to Hinata's intense confusion, was rapidly fading with each moment that passed. Hinata carried the steaming bowl slowly to the table, setting it down as the two continued to talk about this and that. When Sora noticed the delicious-smelling dish beside him though, his words broke off and he began downing the stew at a ravenous pace. Whoa, slow down. You'll throw it all up if you eat that fast. Hinata flushed as Naruto scolded the boy, who slowed down slightly before tipping the broth down his throat, disregarding the spoon. Naruto clucked his tongue as Hinata asked him if he'd like more. Yes please, he chirped, holding up the bowl eagerly. Hinata smiled and took it up from him, filling the porcelain with more. It was eaten in much the same way the next 2 times. After the 4th serving, Sora's eyes had begun to droop sleepily, and Naruto helped him up, careful to mind his back as he led him to the couch in the living room. Tomorrow I want you back with your team, do you hear me? I'm sending you on a mission to Sand soon. Gaara needs some help with an escort and everything's tied up at the moment. The boy didn't seem to hear him, only mumbling an, as Naruto shook his head again and smiled softly. Passed out as soon as he hit the couch. Must be those pain meds Iruka pumped him with. Naruto whispered, watching Hinata clean up after the second dinner. She washed the bowl gently and set in tea. He ran after drying it with a simple blue and white plaid towel. Naruto leaned against the doorframe, watching her silently as she worked, eyes trained on her task as she wiped a countertop and made sure the sink was cleared. She hadn't heard him at all, he supposed. I'm going to bed. Is there anything you need? Hinata paused in putting the soup back in the plastic container and turned over her shoulder. Ah, no. I'm fine. Arigato. Naruto smiled. No, thank you. Not everyone is so tolerant of that kid, he has more enemies than friends. Hinata looked down at her wet hands and shrugged. He seems like a good boy. She murmured. Yeah, he is. Could you get him a blanket before you get to sleep? I'd probably end up tearing the closet down. Hinata laughed softly and Naruto's expression appeared lighter than before. His bruise was completely gone. Before she could ask, he turned and retreated to his study. He'd insisted she take the bedroom, refusing every possible excuse she could think of as to why she shouldn't. In the end there had been no discussion, only her being forced. Hinata brushed aside the busy, buzzing thoughts in her head and fought a yawn. Midnight. She was never used to staying up this late, even at the occasional sleepover of her girlhood. Through the clouds, the moon hung heavy and thick, spreading out her light on the yards and streets. Somewhere down over the crest of the hill where the house stood, two people spoke in hushed voices. A cat hissed and a trash can lid clinked. Hinata rubbed her eyes and flicked off the light over the sink, patting across the floor. The door to the closet slid effortlessly open with a small tug and she soon had collected a beige blanket in her arms, standing up to slide it closed with her foot. The boy didn't stir as she placed the blanket sleepily over him, but his eyes were wide open. Could you do me a favor? Hinata stared at the boy. She hadn't completely noticed he was awake. His head turned, the GHT brown strands of hair touching his forehead. Hinata knelt down. Do you need anything? Her voice was a slow whisper, Sora's stormy eyes pulling on her own. He seemed to think of what he was going to say, but decided against questioning her again. How come you were stuttering at sensei? You don't ever do that, at least, he doesn't say anything about it. Hinata flushed, caught completely off guard. Well, the boy smirked. Oh, I get it. You were getting nervous round, sensei. That's okay, he's pretty powerful you know. The best shinobi in the world. Still, you are his wife. I'd think you of all people wouldn't be so scared of him. Hinata was taken rather aback by the boy's biting words and the heavily sarcastic air that hung round him. Sora was unconvinced, staring at her with interest. Hinata tried to think of something to say. The boy was half right. She did get nervous around Naruto, no matter what age. I'm not scared of Naruto-kun. Her voice wavered and the desired effect didn't entirely take place as Sora continued to smile at her. I'm not. She flushed more and sighed, a bit defeated. Is it really that obvious that I was getting nervous? The boy nodded. Really? I must make him feel so uncomfortable, he must be so upset about everything. She sniffed a bit, tired and feeling a surge of emotions, mostly the overwhelming desire to cry. Sora, upon seeing his hostess's tears, felt incredibly bad. Hey, it's okay. I mean, I get nervous around sensei too sometimes. It's perfectly natural. Hinata only continued to rub her eyes, sniffling. I wish none of this would have happened. She whimpered, to which Sora became very upset, sitting up as best he could and wringing his hands. He was praying that he truly hadn't made her want to leave his beloved sensei, and although he was wrong, his words seemed to do some helping. Don't say that. I mean, sensei really likes you. Loves you even. He talks about you all the time. You're really likable. Even if you are acting weird and you always look out for me and the other kids. Hinata hiccuped softly, and eyed him, tears leaking a little. Moonlight poured from the windows and Sora stared at the pretty lady who always made him something to eat and asked how his day was when she saw him. The lady that was so soft and kind and smiled and smelled like flowers. Sensei's lady. The one he held hands with and took to the park and out to dinner and got worried and worked up over. The one who had done such special things for him, the one who was more like a mother to him than he'd ever dare admit. He remembered the first time he'd ever seen his sensei act so dumb. Sensei, you look stupid. Sora had been watching Naruto stand in front of the windows all afternoon, smiling at hats and flowers and summer dresses. His strong sensei walking into boutiques with simpering girls who offered him free samples, still in his Hokage's robes for cripe's sake. I bet I do, don't I? I just got to find something for her. I want to surprise her tonight. She thinks I forgot about our anniversary. Naruto had smiled so wide Sora was sure his face was going to break off. And what's so great about a stupid anniversary either? Sora had rubbed the spot where Naruto had flicked him in the nose, scowling. Well, didn't you? You only just remembered yesterday. Sora, one day you're going to find a girl who makes you crazy. I just hope she's half as wonderful as my wife. I bet she's not that great, sensei. Sora had rolled his eyes as right there in the middle of Konoha's busiest street. Naruto had issued the list of things so appealing about his dumb old wife. You think my wife isn't great? That's because you're the stupid one. For one, she's the most beautiful kunoichi in the world. And she puts up with all of my antics. How's that for starters? Sora had frowned. Well, if she puts up with you. But wait, there's more. She cooks amazing ramen. And she always folds my clothes the way I like, and she could kick your ass. Nah-sensei. You want me to prove it? She has mastered the most elaborate defense jutsu I've ever seen, and I've seen about 1,000,000 of those. Yeah, but she couldn't beat me. She's a great kisser too. Sora had grimaced. You still forgot about her anniversary. Our anniversary. And she would never have said anything. Naruto's face had gone all soft then, and Sora had been a bit surprised as he stared into the nearest shop they'd come across. She never would have. She's just too sweet. So, you see, that's why I have got to find something perfect. At least to make up for the little bit of trouble I've caused her. She's given up a lot for me. Like what, sensei? Naruto hadn't replied. Sora had closed his mouth and shoved his hands in his pockets, looking in the window, mimicking his teacher's movements. It was then that Sora had let the demure little items catch his eye. Hey sensei, does she have long hair? Naruto had spent a fortune on those hair combs. They were really nice, even Sora could admit. White ivory and real silver and amethyst flowers, and those sparkly clear ones too. Naruto had beamed when he'd gotten them. Please don't cry. I didn't mean to make you upset. He really loves you, so don't leave him or anything, okay? Hinata continued to stare at him. Why you think he does? She asked. Her voice so soft Sora barely heard it. Why do you look so surprised? Why wouldn't he love you? You're wonderful. Sora blushed bright red. I mean, you can cook nice and stuff. Hinata had giggled. Hey, what's so funny? Nothing. She smiled at him then, touching his head. Please rest and heal so Naruto doesn't have to worry. All right. Sora's face felt warm, and he saw how sleepy she was and nodded. Okay. Hey, you didn't stutter that time. Hinata shook her head, standing up and smoothing her clothes. No, I don't feel nervous anymore. Thank you, Sora-kun. Aura watched her disappear into the darkness. She sure had been acting strange. You must love him a lot too. At least, I think. Sensei's lucky. Sora yawned to himself, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Yeah, really lucky. Sora was gone the next morning. But only after cleaning out the refrigerator. Naruto, calm down. Hinata's shouts were upset as Naruto began to go towards Door saying things along the lines of, killing rats and kids, and, good for nothings. Hinata didn't want him to hurt Sora. Not after all the courage she'd felt. The courage to make Naruto's love something worthwhile. Sometimes, Hinata has come to understand, life just can't go smoothly, and as much as she would have thought she could be easily forgotten, she can't disappear for 2 weeks and not be noticed. Hinata, are you home? Hinata stiffened, the afternoon sun hitting her back. She knew that voice. It was gruffer and deeper than she remembered, but she'd know that voice anywhere. Panicking, Hinata tried to remember what Naruto had said a few days earlier. Try not to answer the door, we'll just let them think you're sick till festival, we can at least think of something till then. Scrambling, Hinata got up from a plant book and nearby specimen she was attempting to learn about for the sliding door. Her pale hands fumbled with the handle, and she clearly heard the increased shouting from the front of the house. They'd be here in moments, they must have been able to smell her. Just have to get inside. She shouted internally, yanking it open. She had to get in before. There you are. Where've you been? Today we're supposed to train, remember? Hinata felt a ripple of fear pass over her as she turned rigidly around. She squeezed her eyes shut. She street. Il didn't know what this Kiba would look like, or Akamaru for that matter. K Kiba-kun. Akamaru, G good to SCU. Her eyes pried open. Hey, don't forget Shino. Kiba smiled, fangs gleaming. Hinata flushed scarlet. Not good. Naruto was not going to be happy. She was breaking the rules. Hinata hastily flung some rice balls onto a plate and almost forgot about the kettle, catching it only as it started to scream. Something wrong, Hinata. You appear distracted. Hinata swallowed harshly as Shino stared up at her from behind his glasses and Kiba scratched his head. Yeah, something's different about you. I know it's big, but I can't put my finger on it. Beside him, Akamaru panted lazily and Hinata felt increasingly uncomfortable. No, and nothing out of the ordinary. She squeaked, practically slamming the food on the table in a fit of clumsiness. It wasn't so much them that were the problem, but it was their abilities to pry answers out of her. Shino alone could get her to say things she'd never dreamed of admitting, but with Kiba there it was almost too much. Besides, she could barely look at Kiba right now, let alone talk. He looked. Oh, where did she even start? He'd always been good looking. But now, his hair was longer, pulled back in a short ponytail, and his face had the same rugged handsomeness it had always employed, but now there was no doubt that Iba was a man in the same way Naruto was a man. Testosterone practically leaked out of both of them, or at least she'd found with Naruto it did. Why me? She mumbled pathetically, setting about distributing tea as Kiba dug into the food. Still half talking to a silent and suspicious Shino. What was that? Kiba chewed, tossing the rice ball Shino hadn't touched to Akamaru. Hinata turned around and attempted to smile. Nothing. She passed out tea at record speed and sat down, keeping a great deal of space between herself and her former teammates and honorary brothers, of sorts, searching desperately for something to tell them. Hinata, you sure you're okay? Anything you want to talk about? Seriously, you look like you're about to throw up. Hinata gulped, feeling very hot and bothered. Must have been the sun. You should be more careful. Shino added, eyebrows lowered as he inspected her, most likely seeing straight her sorry excuses. Hi. Okay, seriously, what's up? You're acting like you don't want us here. Quote. That's only half of it. Hinata moaned into her drink, praying neither caught it. What's only half of it? It's not Naruto, is it? No. No. Well. Both men stared at her. Kiba looking peeved and Shino increasingly more accusing. Hinata poked her fingers nervously, a habit that seemed to have recently resurfaced due to circumstances she couldn't control. So it is a Naruto problem. Knew it, Kiba announced, crossing his arms and grumbling. Shino too, nodded his head. Given your level of distress I assume you are experiencing marital turbulence. Hinata found that she could only hang her own head wearily. That's not even the start. So, tell us about it. That bastard running you ragged or something. You don't look too skinny, hell. You might even have put on a little weight. Hinata choked on her tea. Kiba, that was not polite, Shino reprimanded, looking back over at Hinata, pushing up his glasses. You do look healthier. She coughed, attempting to start some kind of defense against the two. So if it's not starvation, what is it? He's not running around on you, is he? Because if he is, I swear. Kiba, Hinata cried, holding up her arms in distress. The young man looked at her and his face melted from its previously savage appearance. Oh, okay, then. Well, he said, easing himself back down. Akamaru too relaxed, fur relaxing like his master's own hair that had started to stand on end. If it's none of these, then what is the problem, Hinata? It often helps alleviate stress to speak of such things, and as a close friend and former team leader I encourage you to tell me things that bother you. Hinata felt defeated. This is very hard to tell you. You wouldn't understand. Naruto wants it to be private. She said quietly, feeling very guilty for not being strong enough to tell two of her closest friends the reason she was just now starting to function normally. Kiba stared at her and Shino continued his gaze from before. It's snuff, snuff, snuff. What is it, Akamaru? You smell it too. Hinata's face turned crimson as Akamaru's massive head shoved itself under her arm and up and down her body. She sat there, being pushed around by the huge dog as it inspected every inch of her, Kiba sniffing the air and Shino looking at them all with absolutely no expression. He was pretty much used to such behaviors after so many years on the same team. Impromptu sniffing was not out of the ordinary at all. But for Hinata it was a little more awkward. Especially when Akamaru started to sniff her chest liberally. And then backed away, a most peculiar face on his doggy features. I thought I smelled something weird since I came in here, Kiba started, taking another whiff and looking at Hinata, but I wasn't gonna say anything. Still, what is it, Kiba? Do you think it's the strange, mysterious illness Ino-san spoke of? Shino looked skeptically at Hinata, the one she contracted sometime last week. Hinata made a move to say something, but found that Shino was daring her to make some kind of argument with his eyes and decided to watch Kiba instead. I've definitely smelled it before, just can't remember. Suddenly, Kiba stopped sniffing and his eyes went wide as dinner plates. Akamaru whined from his place by Kiba's legs and Shino looked at his friend with something that might be traced back to curiosity. What? Exclamation mark quote. Hinata cried, staring at him in alarm. Kiba blinked and looked at Hinata before blinking again. Sorry. If you didn't want me to know, I'm sorry. He mumbled, a light blush fanning his cheeks. Hinata felt panic stir and almost reached across the table to shake the answer out of him. What is it, Kiba? Is she really sick? Kiba shook his head. None of my business. I should have waited. He looked up at Hinata sheepishly. I won't tell anyone, you say when you're ready. Really? Sorry I pressed. Suddenly, he was up out of his seat and yanking up Shino with him. A cheesy excitement taking over his features. Come on Shino, we should go. Shino, not used to such force, sent an icy glare at Kiba. What is the meaning of tea? Come on Shino, we should really go. Kiba grit out staring at him. Shino furrowed his brow and turned to Hinata who appeared rather shaken. Will you be attending festival on Wednesday? Hinata, who had stood as well. Followed Kiba as he dragged Shino and Akamaru out of the house and onto the front drive. Hi. Naruto says it's Manda. I mean, yes, I'm going with Naruto. Shino nodded and then Kiba shrieked. As an army of beetles marched across the arm-fisted into Shino's clothes. The 2 days till festival dragged by, but Naruto got more and more excited with every moment. This is going to be great. Oh, that's right. You've never been to one. Well, that one time I took you, but that was kind of disastrous. He exclaimed on that Wednesday morning. Apparently the whole village had the day off, a kind of holiday. Outside in the streets, shopkeepers hung lanterns and streamers and decorations around the roads and booths were being set up by the river. Hinata, who had received a surprise visit from Sakura on Tuesday, had been given an elaborate recount in specific detail of just what the festival was all about. Naruto started it 2 years ago as an anniversary of peace. He invited diplomatic families from all over the nations to come celebrate. It was a huge hit. Hinata had sat, marveling as Sakura bounced the adorable baby on her knees, both women drinking hot coffee and eating a all tray of cakes that Sakura had bought earlier that morning. The woman's hair was braided that afternoon and her clothes were a typical display of Uchiha crimson and white with Sakura's trademarked beige thrown in. Hinata had sat, feeling somewhat normal as she chattered away, Haru staring at her with wide, black eyes. Anyway, the whole deal is really important to him. I'm sure he's already told you they'll expect to see you. Right. Hinata had nodded slowly. Yes. He says it'll be an excellent way to dispel all the rumors. He thinks if I have some fun, that maybe I'll be able to relax a little. Hinata's fingers tightened on her mug. She felt badly, she should have known that. She should have had him tell her over dinner as they sat across from each other, talking about each other's days. Or at night when they were on the couch flipping through channels. Anything but the stuttering she couldn't seem to get over every time she looked at him or that mile-long distance that engulfed him. He was trying so hard to make her comfortable, but it only made her feel worse. Sakura had let her eyes drop momentarily to her son. You've seemed tense lately. It's been getting to him, he thinks it's his fault. Hinata stared at her tea, her reflection that of a guilty woman she was still unsure about. He shouldn't feel like that. It's not his fault. Sakura sighed lazily and tugged on Hatsuharu's black hair. You know, there was a time when I didn't want you two to be together. Hinata looked up suddenly to find Sakura staring out the window, hand still stroking the ebony strands beneath Haru's ear. I thought that you would always make him feel that way, inadequate. Hinata's eyes were round as dinner plates. Sakura, not wanting Naruto and her to be together. Sakura looked at her in alarm. Oh, don't worry. I definitely don't think that now. It was stupid actually. You both are, well, when everything's normal, you're basically perfect for each other. Hinata sighed in relief, and Sakura let herself relax before continuing. But there was one time I almost said something, well, more like yelled it considering my temper. Hinata licked her lips in apprehension. Sakura, do you mind telling me? I promise I won't judge you, but maybe it will help. Sakura nodded in approval. Yeah, I think it would help you. Hinata's returning smile gave Sakura a wave of hope. It was pouring rain outside and Sakura had been given a hell of a day. That last mission to Demon Country had not ended very well, and a mudslide outside of the village had left the small team in quite the state of injury. But Sakura could handle the broken clavicle and lacerations. Hell, she could even handle the one with head trauma. It was Naruto she was having trouble handling. So, what brings you to my hospital, Naruto? Anything I should know about? Sakura had stated, coming into the room. In truth, she hadn't spoken to her friend in almost a month. He'd been training night and day according to Kakashi. In order to get into Anbu before he turned 20. She went straight to the sink, rinsing her hands and soaping them before drying them with the paper towels beside her head. And finally turned to face her patient with a face that screamed, "This better be good." What she found disturbed her. Naruto was slumped on the examination table, huge bags hugging the skin on his cheeks. His blue eyes were pale and his hair was dull, and he was looking at least 10 pounds underweight. He smiled wearily. Hiya, Sakura-chan. Ruka made me come. Something about me being too skinny. Sakura closed her mouth and shook her head, striding quickly over to him. You're telling me you're practically skin and bones. What exactly have you been doing, you idiot? Naruto coughed and let out a small chuckle. I have to train. He paused as she shone a light into his eyes. Hiyashi says if I don't make it into Anbu before my birthday I can't have her, something about buying worthy or a steady income or something. I get so tired when I get home I don't even have energy to eat or anything, and I keep forgetting about groceries. Sakura felt anger pulse under her fingers. Of course it was Hiyashi. He'd been stirring up nothing but hell since the day Naruto showed even the barest interest in Hinata. That damn man, she hissed out, look at you. You're sick as a dog. If you keep this up, Naruto, your immune system's going to give out. Even if you do have a demon sleeping in your gut, he can't stop you from getting pneumonia. Naruto pulled back from Sakura, and sighed. I have to, Sakura-chan. I can't give up on her. I just can't. I have to do it for her. Do it for her, my ass. Where is she now? According to Kiba, Hinata, and you haven't even spoken since last time you talked to that son of a bitch she calls a father. Naruto looked angry, and for a moment Sakura was worried he was going to yell at her, but he relaxed instantly. She has a good reason, I'm sure. Sakura stood back and crossed her arms, pissed off beyond reason. She should be here. She's the reason you're killing yourself. Working to death just to be with her. She could at least show up. Sakura-chan, please. It's not like that. Her dad is really convinced I can't even attach myself to their name. He doesn't even care if the fourth was my father, not that I care either. I've always carried myself independently, and I'm not about to start now. Well then maybe it's not even worth it. Sakura growled, staring at her friend. He looked at her, eyes flickering, and coughed. Don't say that. I'm serious. All at once the sound of shoes slid into the office. Sakura and Naruto caught sight of Hinata, drenched to the bone, wheeling down the hall through the observation window shades. Well, look who's here. Sakura huffed, opening the door into the hall. He's in. Sakura was cut off as Hinata pushed past her and into the room. Gomen, she whispered as Sakura was jostled back. A biting comeback itching on her wouldn't have hurt her anyways though. because she was staring at the boy on the steel table, and Naruto was also staring at her. "Hina-chan, you're all wet," he said simply as she stared at him through her soaked hair. She was dripping water on the floor as she walked towards him, slowly, and then finally stood right in front of him. "Hina-chan, is something wrong?" Naruto asked, touching her shoulder. The girl trembled beneath her fingers and Sakura saw her hands clenched at her sides. "Why?" Naruto looked taken aback as the quivering word shot out of her shaking lips. "Why are you doing this?" Naruto looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, why?" Hinata brought her head up and her eyes were searing. "I want to know, why, you're doing this to yourself. I want to know why right now." Sakura's eyes widened in shock. Never before had she seen Hinata so blatantly angry, and never in a million years would she have guessed it would be directed toward Naruto. Naruto's blue eyes darkened in anger. "You want to know, why, I'm doing this? Do you? Don't you already know? I'm doing this so we can be together, so maybe, just maybe, I won't blacken your precious family name. Isn't that what your father wants, Hinata, for me to prove myself? Isn't that what you wanted?" Slap. The sound echoed across the room as Naruto's mouth fell open a fraction. Blue eyes wide, Hinata sucked in a breath as her hand shivered, still raised. "How dare you?" she whispered, voice thick, "how dare you say that I would ever." Her voice grew in volume as she spoke, "Ever want you to do this to yourself? How dare you say that to me? Baka." Naruto stared at her as she shook, her hand coming to cover her face. "Look at you. You're wasting yourself away. I'm not worth this. I never, ever said I was worth this. When Kakashi told me," she raised her head and looked at him severely, "when Kakashi told me Iruka had to make you come to the hospital, I didn't believe him. I couldn't believe that you would go so far as to let this happen. Do you know how much I worried for you? Kakashi said you weren't eating and my father keeps me tied in that house. There was nothing I could do." Sakura felt her heart break as Hinata sobbed, her tears mingling with the leftover. Reached out his hands and took either side of Hinata's pale face in his palms. "Gomen," he whispered, brining her towards him. "I'm so sorry, Hina-chan. I'm sorry." Her arms wrapped round his shirt, digging into the fabric. "I was so worried." She gasped. Sakura put her hand to her lips and looked away, blinking back. The story had made Hinata feel rushes of relief. It was proof that she and Naruto were not perfect, and if they could make it through her father, they could make it now. Not to mention that she had grown up inside and out at some point, and if she did it once she would do it again. It was a ray of hope in a fast darkening place for Hinata. And unlike Sora's own speeches and Kakashi's words of encouragement, it gave her something to hold on to. The memory was now ingrained in her brain, and with it she felt she might actually be able to make one tinier step towards something bigger. So as she stood in the kitchen with the boy who starved himself for her, going on about the festival, she found herself feeling very courageous. He took a deep breath and looked at her husband with all the strength she could muster. She started slowly, it sounds like a wonderful time. Naruto's mouth had spread into a huge smile. "Wow, Hina-chan, you didn't even stutter." By 7 o'clock sharp, night had fallen on the village and suddenly, everything came alive. Hinata stood on the street, her arm tucked into the crook of Naruto's arm and looked anxiously about her. "Don't worry, I'm right here. Just be yourself. Everyone loves you," he whispered, grinning at the child who passed him and waved. People from all over were milling about in families and pairs. A few young couples went by and some blushing mad genin as well, all dressed in their best yukata for the occasion. Hinata's own, she'd found on her side of the closet thankfully, was a bright turquoise adorned with yellow and pink flowers and pearly white dragon flies. It fit wonderfully and Hinata was glad that it was modest and fashionable. She'd been worried about what Sakura had meant when she'd said, "Ino bought your yukata last year." But even she, with her makeup done and her hair combed back with the lovely combs she'd found in a large jewelry box, was pale in comparison to the sun that shone beside her. Decked in red and orange instead of the traditional Hokage's robes and with his hair somewhat done, Naruto was unlike anything she'd ever seen. She blushed as he ushered her past streets and the whispering crowds that passed them, and when her arm became jostled from his rough hand captured hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Hokage-sama! Hokage-sama! Look what we won! They had just passed a game booth where Naruto had tried his luck at winning when the tiny shrill voices had broke from their stupor. Turning, Yuto and Hinata laid eyes on 3 giggling little girls, no more than 7 Hinata presumed. All 3 of them were blushing and shifting their weight as they held out their prizes for him to inspect. "You won that. What game?" Naruto exclaimed, staring at a small turtle in a tiny cardboard box. The girl, whose front teeth were missing, laughed with her friends. "This is not a game, Hokage-sama. You fish for them." Naruto's eyes widened in mock surprise and Hinata couldn't help but smile too, hiding her mouth with her sleeve nervously. Suddenly all 3 girls looked up at her in awe. "Hinata, you look so pretty," the first girl squealed, putting her hands on her small face. "Hinata, do you think this is a nice color? My mother bought it for me," the other said, showing her obi. Hinata looked at each and blinked. "Ah." The 3 looked at her in return, faces shining in the lantern light. Hinata closed her eyes and when she opened them, her smile was enormous. She bent over SLIGHTLY and suddenly was on eye level with the 3. "You all look like princesses. Don't they?" Hinata turned around and the 3 turned with her to find 3 boys whispering to themselves. All of them were at least 12 and they were all staring at her. When she addressed them, they all blushed and stood up straighter. The 3 little girls all put their hands to their faces and began to giggle excitedly. "These 3 princesses deserve something special, don't you think? I say you treat them to dango as a start." Hinata straightened and looked at the boys with a small smile and the 3 blushed and laughed nervously. "Hi Hinata-san," one said, stepping past them to offer his hand to the 3 squealing girls. The other 2 looked at each other and shrugged, finally inching past to follow suit. When they had disappeared, Hinata had immediately put her hand to her mouth. "Oh, I can't believe I did that," she whispered, staring at the ground. "I suppose, well, every girl wishes it sometime." "You are incredible," Naruto said softly, tugging at her hand. Those 3 boys were from sound. Hinata couldn't say anything, only follow as Naruto led her on to the next booth and the next giggling group of children. The night wore on with more fried food than Hinata thought imaginable and more people than Hinata had ever thought she could see in one night. Even Neji was there with Tenten. His wife she'd immediately inferred, dragging along a stubborn Tetsuya and a rosy-cheeked baby dubbed by her nephew as Nao-chan. But that night something far more important happened than seeing Shikamaru Nara almost taken out by his wife for lack of interest. It happened that when one is the wife of the Hokage, one is offered a lot of free things. Food, game tries, coupons, anything that could be handed out at festival was given to her on site. And one of these things was sake. Now Hinata was not a big drinker even though she'd had sake several times at home as ceremony, and there was once that mission when they were 14 and mistaken for older civilians. That had not ended well. It turns out that Kiba can be a very persuasive person when intoxicated and the whole idea of, "Trust me, we can swim in a fountain" was not exactly as correct an experiment as it was in theory. So when the man had eagerly persisted that the Hokage and his wife try at least a cup full of his famous rice wine, who was Hinata to decline? Hinata was only on her 3rd glass, standing by the booth, watching in a very shy happiness as Sasuke and Naruto attempted to win a stuffed bear, each failing miserably as Sakura stood by shooting glares at her husband. It was only coincidence that Kiba should show up with Shino and upon seeing her beverage come rushing over, Hinata's wrist was BBED up just as she'd raised the cup to her lips and much to her surprise was downed by not her, but an Inuzuka. "Kiba!" she exclaimed, staring at him in disbelief. The boy dropped the glass on the ground and stared at her. "What are you doing, Hinata? Don't you know?" he shouted. Hinata shook her head in confusion, a bit loose thanks to the alcohol, and waited for him to answer. A crowd of drunk shinobi passed by with shouts and Hinata missed the reply, stepping closer. "What?" she asked again, this time her voice raised. Sakura turned towards the 2 and Naruto did as well, just about to sigh in defeat. Just as Kiba opened his mouth. "I said," he shouted louder, "that's bad for the baby." Hinata couldn't believe her ears. That's it for today, I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends and don't forget to check out my Patreon. Details in description.